Chapter 52 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 52. A Talk with the Squire. Harry proved how hungry he was by eating a huge dinner. He had the old dining room to himself, and sipped his brandy and water there by a pleasant fire of coal and spluttering wood. With a button or two undone, he gazed drowsily into the fire, with his head thrown back, and his eyes nearly closed, and the warmth of the fire, and the glow of the alcohol flushed his cheeks and his nose and his forehead to a brilliant chrism. Harry had had a hard day's riding, some agitations, great variety of air, and now, as we have seen, a hearty dinner and many glasses of brandy and water, and a hot fire before him. Naturally, he fell asleep. He dreamed that the old squire was dead and buried. He forgot all about the little boy at Carwell, and fancied that he, Harry Fairfield, draped in the black mantle with which the demure undertaker hangs the mourners in chief, had returned from the funeral and was seated in the old oak parlour, just in all other respects as he actually was. As he sat there, master of Wyvern at last, and listening, he thought, to the rough tick of the old clock in the hall, old Tom Ward seemed to him to bounce in, his mulberry-coloured face turned the colour of custard, his mouth agape, and his eyes starting out of their sockets. "Get up, Master Harry," the old servant seemed to say, in a woundy tremor, "for may the devil fetch me if here bain't the old master back again, and he's in the blue room calling for ye." "Ye lie," gasped Harry, waking up in a horror. "Come ye quick, Master Harry, for when the squire calls, it's ill tarrying," said now the real voice of Tom Ward. "Where?" "In the blue chamber." Where am I?" said Harry, now on his feet and looking at Tom Ward. "By jingo, Tom, I believe I was dreaming. You gave me a hell of a fright. And is he there really? Very well." And Harry walked in and found the old squire of Wyvern standing with his back to the fire, tall, gaunt, and flushed, and his eyes looking large, with the glassy sheen of age. "Well, why didn't you tell me the news, you fool?" said the squire as he entered. "Damn ye, if it hadn't a been for Tom Ward, I shouldn't have heerd nowt of the matter. So there's a brat down in Carwell Grange. Ha, ha! Marriage is honourable, I've heerd tell, but housekeeping's costly. 'Tis the old tune on the bagpipe. That's the way to Beggar's Bush. When marriage gets into the saddle, repentance gets up at the crupper. Why the devil didn't you tell me the news? Why didn't you tell me, you damned weatherhead? So I would have told ye to-night, but I fell asleep after dinner. It's true enough, though, and there's doctors and nurses and caudles and all sorts. Well, for Charlie he's out of the way. Dead mice feels no cold, you know, and she's a bad 'un. Alice Maybell's a bad 'un. The vicar was a thankless loon, and she's took after him. She went her own gait, and much good it did her. Sweetheart and Honeybird keeps no house, and the devil's bread is half bran. She'll learn a lesson now. I was too good to that hussy. Put another man's child in your bosom, they say, and he'll creep out at your sleeves. She's never a friend now. She's lost Charlie, and she's lost me. Well might the cat wink when both her eyes were out. She'd like well enough to be back here again in Wyvern, damn her. She knows who was her best friend by this time, right well pleased wi' herself. I'll be bound the day she gied us the slip and ran off with the fool Charlie, down in the mouth, I warrant her now, the jade. I dare say the parson's down at the Grange every day to pray wi' my lady and talk o' resignation. When all their rogueries breaks down, they take to cantin' and psalm-singin', and turns up their eyes, the limers, and cries the Lord's will be done. Welcome, death, quoth the rat, when the trap fell. Much thanks to 'em for takin' what they can't help. Well, she's a bad 'un. A black-hearted, treacherous lass she proved. And Charlie was a soft fellow and a mad fellow, and so his day's over. And I was just a daft old fool, and treated according. But time and thought tames all, and we shall all lie alike in our graves. And what's the boy like? The old man resumed. Is he like Charlie? He was asleep, and the room dark, so there was no good trying to see him, said Harry, inventing an excuse. Not a bit dark or light, not a bit? He's Ally's son, and good won't grow from that stock, never. As the old bird crows, so crows the young, and that foreign madam I hear swears she was married first to poor Charlie. And what's that to me? Not that spoonful of punch. She's up in limbo, and if her story be true, why then that boy of Ally's ain't in the runnin', and his mother, bless her heart, needn't trouble her head about Wyvern, nor be wishin' the old squire that was good to her under the sod, to make way for her son, and then there's you to step in and claim my shoes and my chair, and cellar key, and then Madam, what's her name, Van Trump, or something, will out wi' a bantling, I take it, and you'll all fight it out, up and down, kick, throttle, and bite, in the court of chancery, or where you can, and what is it to me who wins or who loses? Not that bit of lemon peel. And if you think I'm going to spend a handful of money in law to clear up a matter that don't concern me, no more than the cat's whisker, you're a long way out in your reckoning. Be my soul, ye are, for I'll not back none of ye, and I won't sport a shillin', and I don't care a damn. Ye'll fight the battle over my grave, and ye'll take Wyvern who can, and 'twill cost ye all round a pretty penny. Ye'll be sellin' your shirts and your smocks, and you're pretty well in for it, and ye can't draw back. Well lathered is half shaved, and it won't break my heart, I promise you. And the old man chuckled and hooted and wagged his head fiercely as he declaimed in his own way upon the row that was coming. Don't ye spare one another for my sake. Take Wyvern who can. I'll keep my hands in my pockets, I promise ye. What have I to do wi' other folks' windmills? So the old squire stormed on more serenely than he had done for a long time. Make another tankard of that thing, Tom. Make a big one, and brew it well, and fetch a rummer for yourself, lad. Beggars breed for rich men to feed, resumed the squire. A son at the Grange of Carwell, no less. Well, I taken enough and too much on my shoulders in my day, and 'tis often the least boy carries the biggest fiddle. She's a sly lass, Alice. She'll find fools enough to help her. I done wi' her. She's a bad 'un. Look at that harpsichord thing there she used to play on. He pointed to the piano. I got that down from Noulton for her to jingle tunes at as long as she liked, and I'd had it smashed up and pitched in the river, only 'twould make her think I cared enough about her to take that trouble about her lumber. She turned her back on me when she liked, and I'll not turn my face on her when she lists. A graceless hussy she was and is, and grace lasts but beauty blasts. And so let it be for me. That's enough. I take it there's no more to tell. So take ye a candle if you're sleepy, man. No use dawdling sluggard's guise. Loath to bed and loath to rise. And so, with a gruff nod, he dismissed him. And in came Tom Ward with the punch before very long. That's good, Tom. That'll warm your ribs. How long you been here? Wyvern always, but a long time in the house. Tom a long time wi' the family. 'Tis 60 years ago, Tom. I remember you in our livery. Isabel and blue, them's the old colours. They don't know the name now. Salmon, they calls it. We ha' seen Christmas pretty often in the old house. We'll not see many more, I'm thinking. The tale's nigh done. 'Twasn't bad times we here, Tom. We can't complain. We ha' had our share. And after cheese comes nothing, as the old folks used to say. Take the rummer, and sit ye down by the door, Tom. There's Master Harry. I'd rather hae a glass wi' ye, Tom, than a dozen wi' him. A damned pippin squeezin' rascal. Tom, ain't he a sneak? No Fairfield, Tom, ain't he? Ain't he, damn ye? I won't say that all out, sir. He's a tall, handsome lad, and Master Harry can sit down and drink his share like a man. Like a beast, you mean. He never tells ye a pleasant story, nor laughs like a man. And what liquor he swallows, it goes into a bad skin, Tom. He's not hot and hearty in his cups like a Fairfield. He has no good nature, Tom. He's so close-fisted and cunning. I hate them fellows that can't buy at the market and sell at the fair, and drink when he's drinking, damn him. He's always a-watchin' to do ye, just like his mother, a screw she was, and her sons like her, crooked to sell and crooked to buy. I hate him sober, Tom, and I hate him drunk. Bring your glass here, old lad. A choice mugful you've brewed tonight. Hold it straight, you fool. What was I saying? The old things is out of date, Tom. The world's changin', and 'tain't in nature, Tom, to teach old dogs tricks. I do suppose there's fun goin', though. I don't see it, and the old folks beginnin' to be in the way, as they were always, and things won't change for us. We were brave lads, we Fairfields, but there's no one to come now. There won't be no one after me in Wyvern House. To the wrestlin' on Wyvern Fair Green when I was a boy, I mind the time when lords and ladies had come ridin' down for 20 miles round, and all the old stock of the country, some on horseback and some in coaches, and silks and satins, to see the belt played for, and single stick and quarter-staves. They were manly times, Tom, and a Fairfield ever first in the field. And what year is this? I was 20 the week before that day. 'Tis 64 years ago, when I threw Dick Dutton over my shoulder and broke his collarbone, and Dutton was counted the best man they ever brought down here. And Meg Weeks, you'll mind Meg Weeks, wi' the hazel eyes, was looking on. And the wrestlin's gone, and not a man left in the country round that could tell a quarter staff from a flail. And when I'm gone to my place in the churchyard, there's not a Fairfield in Wyvern no longer, for I don't count Harry one. He's not a Fairfield, by no chance, and never was. Charlie had it in him, handsome Charlie. I seen many a turn in him like me, I did. And that Captain Jolliffe's died only t'other day that he shot in the arm at Tewkesbury, only 20 years ago, for saying a wry word o' me. Old Morton read it yesterday. He says in the Lunan paper. But it's all over wi' Charlie. And stand up, Tom, and fill your glass, and we'll drink to him. Old Tom Ward was the first to speak after. Hot blood and proud, sir, and a bit wild when he was young. More than that there's nowt to be said by any. A brave lad, sir, and the good-naturedest I ever see. He shouldn't be buried where he is, alone. I don't like that, nohow. He wouldn't ha' done so by you, Squire. He liked ye well. He liked everyone that was ever kind to him. I mind how he cried after poor Master Willie. They too was very like and loving. Master Willie was tall like him and handsome. "Don't ye be talking o' them at all, you fool," broke in the squire violently. "Stop that, and hold your tongue, Tom. Damn you, do you think I'm foolish? Light my candle, and get ye to bed. The tankard's out. Get ye to bed, ye damned old fool." And he shook the old servant hard by the hand as he spoke. End of chapter 52. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 53 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery. By Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Harry Fairfield grows uneasy. A few days later, Harry Fairfield rode from Wyvern into the picturesque little town of Wickford, and passing the steep, narrow bridge, pulled up near the church, at the door of Dr. Willett. Harry had something to say to the doctor, but like a good diplomatist, that shrewd dealer in horses preferred letting the doctor talk a bit on his own account first. He found him in slippers and dressing-gown, clipping his evergreens that grew in front of his house, the hour of his forenoon excursion not having yet arrived. "Woodman, spare that tree," said Harry, quoting a popular song facetiously. The doctor looked up. "And how is Dr. Willett this morning?" said Harry. Oh, is that you?" said the doctor, straightening his back with a little effort, for he had been stooping to his task, and old backs don't unbend in a moment. "Quite well, thank you. So are you, I see." "Can't complain. And how's the old squire?" said the doctor. "How's the old house?" answered Harry. "Staunch and straight, and like to stand forever. I see no change in him. And all well over at Carwell?" "Far from it," said the doctor. "And who's sick?" "The poor young mother. Very ill indeed," said he. "Nervous, low, and feverish she has been, and yesterday, when I saw her, it was plainly fever, quite declared." "What sort of fever?" asked Harry. "Well, the nerves are very much engaged," began the doctor. "Take care it ain't typhus," said Harry. "The baby hain't got it, I hope?" "No, the child's all safe. There's typhus down at Grice's Mill, and a child in scarlatina in the glen, I hear." "Is there, huh? It has been going a good deal at that side, I'm told," said Dr. Willett. "There's Lady Windale at Noulton. Very good-natured she seems to be. Wouldn't she take the child and nurse it for a while? It's a nice place, well enclosed, and lies high. Not likely to get in there. I attended a patient there in dropsy once, when it was let, and the Windale's away in India." "Aye, she's good-natured. She'd have the mother and child together with a welcome, but she says she won't take no one's babby to nurse away from its people, and she's right, I think. So the young chap must stand his ground and bide the fortune of war, you know." "What time should you be there today?" he inquired. 3 o'clock. "Very well, then. I'll be passing at the mill end of the glen about that time, and I'll ride up and look in, just to hear what you have to say, and I'll get home by Cressley Common. It'll do me as well as t'other way. I turned aside a bit to reach you and hear the news, and I must be jogging again. Good-bye, doctor." "Is your church clock right?" said Harry, looking up at the old tower and pulling out his watch to compare. "The clock goes as it pleaseth the clerk," the old saw tells us. "But we all go by the clock here, and it does keep right good time," said old Doc Willett, with his hand over his eyes, reading its golden hands and figures, as Harry was. "Well, then, Doctor, good-bye, and God bless ye," said Harry, and away he rode without hearing the doctor's farewell. At Carwell Grange at 3 o'clock there was the gloom and silence of a sick-house. The tiptoed tread of old Dulcibella and her whisperings at the door were scarcely audible, and now and then a weary moan was heard in the darkened room, and the wail and squall of a little child from another room not far off. Old Mildred Tarnley had undertaken the charge of the child, while Dulcibella, with the aid of a neighbor brought in for the occasion, took charge of the sick lady. Before 3 o'clock came, to the surprise of this sad household, Harry Fairfield arrived. He did not come riding, he arrived in a tax cart. He had got through more real work that day than many men who were earning their bread by their labor. "Give this one a feed, Tom." "And how's all here?" said he, throwing the apron off and jumping down. "Bad enough, I'm afraid, sir." "Worse?" "I don't know, sir, till the doctor comes, but can't be no better, for I heard Mrs. Crane say she didn't close an eye all night." "I hope they're not forgetting the child in the hurry," said Harry. "Mrs. Tarnley and Lily Dogger looks after him turn about. That wouldn't do nohow, you know," said Harry. "And give her a good feed, Tom. Good dog, good bone. She came at a good lick, I can tell you, up the glen. The doctor will be here soon." "Aye, sir. Well, I'll stay here till I hear what he says. And there's sickness in Carwell Glen here, I'm told." "I dessay, sir. There's a good deal going, I hear." "Ye needn't take her out of the shafts, Tom. Fix her head in a halter by the gate, in the ring there, if you have a nose-bag at hand, and come in here. She's as quiet as a lamb. I want to talk to you a bit. I'm going to buy 2 or 3 fillies, and think of any you may have seen down about here. Old Tarnley's in the kitchen now, is she?" "I think she is, sir." "Well, think of them fillies if you can. There's business to be done if I can get 'em to suit." So in marched Harry and tapped at the kitchen window and nodded and smiled to Mrs. Tarnley. "So you're all sick down here, I'm told, but sickness is better than sadness." "That's all I can say, lass," said Harry, pacing much in his usual way into the kitchen and clapping his big hand down on Mildred's shoulder. "Sick, sore, and sorry we be, sir. Your brother's not that long buried that there should be no sadness in the Grange. His own house that was, and his widow's, that is. Sickness may well be better than sadness, but 'tain't turn about wi' them here, but one and t'other both together. And that slut upstairs, Miss Dogger, if you please, out of the scullery into the bedchamber. She's no more use to me than the cock at the top of Carwell steeple. I never knew such times in Carwell Grange. I'm wore off my old feet. I can't stand it long, and I wish 20 times in a day I was quiet at last in my grave. A gruntin' horse and a grumblin' wife, they say, lasts long. Never you fear. You won't die this time, old girl, and I wouldn't know the Grange if you wasn't here. 'Twill all be right again soon, I warrant. No wind blows long at the highest, you know. And we'll hear what the doctor says just now." "Hoot! What can the doctor say? but just the old thing. The leech to the physic, and God to the cure, and death will do as God allows, and sickness shows us what we are, and all fears the grave as the child does the dark. I don't know much good he's doin' as much as he did for Master Charles, not but he's as good as another, and better than many a one, maybe, but he costs a deal of money, and only Lady Windale came over here yesterday, poorly though she is, and not able to get out of her coach, and saw Mrs. Crane, and lent a 50-pund note to keep all straight till the young lady, please God, may be able to look about her and see after 'em herself. We'd have been at a sore pinch before the week was out. Pity's good, but help's better. 'Tis well in this miserly world there's a kind one left here and there, that wouldn't let kindred want in the midst of plenty. There's Squire Harry Wyvern, and his own little grandson lying up in the cradle there. And look at you, Master Harry. I wonder you hadn't the thought." Harry laughed, perhaps the least degree awkwardly. "Why, chickabiddy," began Harry. "I'm none of your chickabiddies. I'm old Mildred Tarnley o' the Grange o' Carwell, that's in the service o' the family. Her and hers, many a long year, and I speaks my mind. And I shouldn't like the family to be talked of, as it will for meanness. If there's a want of money here in times of sickness, 'tis a shame." "Well, you know there's no want, but the governor's riled just now, and he'll come round again, and as far as me, I'm as poor a dog as is in the parish. Take me and turn me round and round, and what more am I than just a poor devil that lives by horses, and not always the price of a pot of stout in my pocket. 4 farthings and a thimble makes the tailor's pocket jingle." "Your tongue's a bit hard, Mildred, but you mean well, and there's kindness at the bottom of the mug, though the brew be bitter." "I think I hear the doctor," said Mildred, placing her palm behind her ear and listening. "Aye," said Harry, "I hear him talking." And forth he strode to meet him. Before he went up, Harry and the doctor talked together for a little in the panelled sitting-room with which we are familiar. "I'm sure to see you here, eh?" "Before I go? Yes. I shall look in here." "All right," said Harry, and the doctor walked up the stairs on his exploration. End of chapter 53. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 54 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 54. A Drive to Twyford. In less than 10 minutes the doctor came down. "Well?" said Harry over his shoulder, turning briskly from the window. "No material change," replied the doctor. "It's not a case in which medicine can do much. The most cheering thing about it is that her strength has not given way. But you know, it is an anxious case. A very anxious case. I hope they're taking care of the child. Old Dulcibella Crane would be a deal better for that sort of thing than that dry old cake Mildred Tarnley. But then Allie would half break her heart if you took old Dulcibella from her. Always used to her, you know. And what's best to be done? It would be bad enough to lose poor Allie, but it would be worse to lose the boy. For though I'm willing to take my share of work for the family, there's one thing I won't do, and that's to marry. I'm past the time, and damn me if I'd take half England to do it. I'd like to manage and nurse the estate for him, and be paid, of course, like other fellows, and that's what would fit my knuckle. But by Jove, if they kill that boy, among them there would be no one to maintain the old name of Wyvern. And kill him they will, if they leave him in the hard hands of that wiry old girl, Mildred Tarnley. She's a cast-iron old maid, with a devil's temper, and she has a dozen other things to mind beside. And I know the child will die, and I don't know anything to advise. Damn me if I do. The house is in confusion, and very little attention for the child, certainly, said Dr. Willett. And that damned Scarlatina, beyond a doubt, is in the glen there. The old doctor shrugged and shook his head. I talked to the governor a bit, said Harry, thinking he might have the child over to Wyvern, where it would be safe and well looked after, but he hates the whole lot. You know it was a stolen match, and it's no use trying in that quarter. You're going now, and I'll walk a little beside you. Maybe you'll think of something, and I haven't no money, you may guess, to throw away, but rather than the child shouldn't thrive, I'll make out what would answer. That's very kind of you, sir, said Dr. Willett, looking at him admiringly. They certainly have their hands pretty full here, and a little neglect sometimes goes a long way with a child. So they walked out together, talking, and when the doctor got on his horse, Harry walked beside him, part of the way towards Cressley Common. When he came back to the Grange, Harry asked to see old Dulcibella, and he told her, standing on the lobby and talking in whispers, "The doctor says she's not able to understand anything as she is at present. Well, you know she's wandering just now, but she may clear up a bit for a while by and by. Well, the doctor says she's not to be told a word that can fret her, and particularly about the child, for he says this is no place for it, and he won't be answerable for its life if it's left longer here. And there's scarlatina and fever all round, and ye have as much as ye can handle here already. So few as there is, without nursing children. And Dr. Willett says he'll have it well attended to by a person near Wickford, and I'll bring old Mildred over with it to the place this evening, and we'll get it out of reach o' the sickness that's going, please God," said Dulcibella after a pause. "Amen," added Harry, and walked down, whistling low, with his hands in his pockets, to tell the same story to old Mildred Tarnley. "'Tis a pity," she said darkly, "the child should be sent away from its home." "Especially with scarlet fever and typhus all round," said Harry. "And away from its mother," she continued. "Much good its mother is to it. Just now she mayn't be able to do much." "Oh, but she can, though," interrupted Harry. "She may give it the fever she's got, whatever that is." "Well, I can't say nothing else, but it's a pity the child should be took away from its natural home and its own mother," repeated Mrs. Tarnley. "And who's taking care it now?" demanded Harry. "Lily Duggar," answered she. "Lily Duggar? Just so, the slut! You said yourself today you wouldn't trust a kitten with." Mrs. Tarnley couldn't deny it. She sniffed and tossed up her chin a little. "You forget, lass, 'twas never a Wyvern fashion nursing the babbies at home. I wasn't, nor Charlie, poor fellow, nor Willie, nor none of us. 'Twas a saying with the old folk, and often ye heard it, 1 year a nurse, and 7 years the worse. And we all was tall, well-thriven lads, and lives long, without fever or broken bones or the like, floors us untimely. And anyhow the doctor says so it must be. There's no one here. All the sickness in the house has time to look after it, and the child will just come to grief unless his orders be followed. So stick on your bonnet and roll up the young chap in blankets, and I'll drive ye over to the place he says. It brings me a bit out of my way, but kith and kin, you know. And I told the doctor if he went to any expense I'd be answerable to him myself. And I'll gie ye £1 for good luck. So you see, I'm not sich a screw all out as ye took me for. I thank you, Master Harry. And I'll not deny but was always the way we the family to send out the children to nurse. And what Mr. Charles would have done himself if he was alive, as every one of us knows. And for that reason, what the lady upstairs would have done, if she had have been able to talk about anything. I'm sorry I have to drive ye over, but I'll bring ye back tonight. And, you know, I couldn't drive and manage the babby. And the folk would be wondering when the child set up the pipes in the tax cart. And I'd soon have the hue and cry behind me. Hoot! I wouldn't allow no such thing as let the poor little thing be druv so, all alone, like a parcel of shop goods. No, no, the family's not come to that yet a bit, I hope, cried Mrs. Tarnley. Give me a lump of bread and cheese and a mug of beer. I don't think I ever was here before without a bit and a sup, and it wouldn't be lucky, you know, to go without enough to swear by, anyhow. And there's no hurry, mind. You needn't be ready for a good hour to come, for Willett won't have no nurse there sooner. Harry went out and had a talk with Tom Clinton, smoked his pipe for half an hour, and Tom thought that the young squire was dull and queerish. And perhaps he was not very well, for he did not eat his bread and cheese, but drank a deal more beer than usual instead. Bring a lot of lollipops and milk, or whatever it likes best, will ye, to keep it quiet? I can't abide the bawling of children. Lily Dogger, with red eyes and an inflamed nose, blubbered, heartbroken, and murmured to the baby, lest old Mildred should overhear and blow her up, her leave-takings and endearments, as she held it close in her arms. Beautiful enough to us men, utterly mysterious is the feminine love of babies. Lily Dogger had led a serene, if not a cheerful, life at Carwell Grange up to this. But now came this parting, and her peace was shivered. Old Mildred had now got up, with her threadbare brown cloak and her grisly old bonnet, and had arranged the child on her lap. So at last, all being ready, the tax cart was in motion. It was late in the autumn now. The long days were over. They had dawdled away a longer time than they supposed before starting. It turned out a long drive, much longer than Mildred Tarnley had expected. The moon rose, and they had got into a part of the country with which he was not familiar. They had driven 14 miles or upward, through a lonely and somewhat melancholy country. It was, I suppose, little better than moor, but detached groups of trees, possibly the broken and disappearing fragments of what had once been a forest, gave it a sad sort of picturesqueness. Mildred Tarnley was not a garrulous person, and had not spent her life at Carwell Grange without learning the accomplishment of taciturnity. But she remarked and resented the gloomy silence of Master Harry, who had never once addressed a word to her since they started. Toward the close of their journey, she observed that Harry Fairfield looked frequently at his watch, hurried the pace of the mare, and altogether seemed to grow more and more anxious. They had been obliged to pull up twice to enable her to feed the baby, who was now fast asleep. "'Tis right," she thought. "He should look ahead and mind his driving while we're getting on." Though a word now and then would not have troubled him much, but when we stopped to feed the child there was no excuse. He got down and settled the buckle at the horse's head. He got up again and drew the rug over his knees, and he leaned on his elbow back upon the cushion, and he never so much as asked, was me or the baby alive? They now reached a gentle hollow, in which a shallow brook crossed the road, and some 4 or 5 habitations of a humble sort stood at either side, one under the shade of 2 gigantic ash trees, and a sign depending in front, being a wayside inn of the humblest dimensions. A village this could hardly be termed, and at the near end Harry pulled up before a building a little above the rank of a cottage, old and quaint, with a large leafed plant that in the moonlight looked like a vine growing over the prop of a sort of porch that opened under the gable. If the mare was quiet at the Grange, you may be sure that her run to Twyford had not made her less so. Harry helped old Tarnley down, with her little charge in her arms, and led her silently into the neat little room with tiers of delf ornaments in brilliant colours on the cupboard, and a Dutch clock ticking in the nook by the fire where some faggots crackled, and a candle was burning on the table in a bright brass candlestick. Mrs. Tarnley's experienced eye surveyed the room and its belongings. She decried, moreover, a ladder stair which mounted to a loft, from whose dormant window, as she looked from her seat in the tax cart, she had observed the light of a candle. Very humble it undoubtedly was, but nothing could be more scrupulously clean. It had an air of decency, too, that was reassuring. There was a woman there in a cloak and bonnet who rose as they entered and curtsied. Harry set a lumbering armchair by the fire and beckoned Tarnley to occupy it. Then he asked, "How soon is the Warhampton bus expected?" "25 minutes, please, sir," answered the woman with another curtsy and a glance at the clock. "That woman from Willets is coming by the bus," he said gruffly to Mildred. "'Tis a snug little place, this, and as clean as a bone after a hungry dog. Would you mind," he continued, addressing the stranger or hostess, whichsoever she might be, "telling Archdale if he's here, I want a word wi' him at the door." "He's over the way, I think, sir, with the horse. I'll call him, please, sir." So off she went. This is where poor Charles said he'd like to have his child nursed, Twyford. 'Tis sweet air about here, considered. He was expecting a babby, poor fellow, and he talked a deal wi' me about it the day he was took. Wouldn't ye like a bit to eat and a glass of beer or something? They have lots over the way, for as poor as it looks. And here's the £1 I promised ye, lass, for luck, you know, when we was leaving the Grange. He drew forth the hand with which he had been fumbling in his pocket and placed the piece of gold in hers. "Thank you, Master Harry," she said, making a little instinctive effort to rise for the purpose of executing a curtsy, but Harry, with his hand on her shoulder, repressed it. "Sit ye quiet and rest yourself, after jogging all this way. And what's that bundle?" "The baby's things, sir." "All right. Well, and what will you have?" "I feel a bit queerish, Master Harry, I thank ye. I'd rather not eat nothing till I gets home, and I'll get my cup of tea then." "Not eat?" "Nothing, sir, I thank ye, Master Harry." "Well," said Harry, so far forth relieved, but resolved, cost what it might, to make Mildred happy on this particular occasion, "if ye won't eat, I'm hanged but ye shall drink some. I tell ye what it shall be, a jug of sherry negus. Come ye must." "Well, Master Harry, as so you will have it, I'll not say ye nay," consented Mildred graciously. Harry went himself to the little pothouse over the way, and saw this nectar brewed, and brought it over in his own hand, the tankard in one hand and the glass in the other. "Devilish good stuff it is, Mildred, and I'm glad, old lass, I thought of it. I remember you liked that brew long ago, and much good may it do you, girl." He was trying to be kind. He had set it down on the table, and now as he spoke he laid his hand on her shoulder, and she thought she might have wronged Master Harry with his rough jests and shrewd ways, and that he had more of the Fairfield in his nature than she had always given him credit for. Out he went again, and talked with Archdale, who was in plain clothes and a round hat, with a great coat buttoned up to his smooth blue chin, and a gig whip in his hand. Archdale, as usual, was severely placid and brief, and as Harry talked with him outside, Mildred Tarnley thought she heard a step in the loft over her head, and another sound that excited her curiosity. She listened, but all was quiet again. Harry returned in comparatively high spirits. "Well, Mrs. Tarnley," said he, "the bus is a bit late, I'm thinking. But anyhow, he can't wait," and he pointed over his shoulder at Mr. Archdale, who stood at the door. "He'll drive you back again, and he knows the road as far as Cressley Common, and you can show him the rest. And you'll want to be back again with poor Alice. And the doctor will look in here often in the week, almost every day, and tell you how the little chap's going on. And see, here's a very respectable woman. What's her name? She was here this minute, and she won't be leaving till after the bus comes in. And you leave her the baby, and I'll wait here till I see it in charge of the nurse that's coming from Wickford. Come in, will ye? Not you, the woman, I mean. Now, Mildred, give her the baby." The woman had a gentle, cheerful, and honest face, and looked down with the angelic light of a woman's tenderness on the sleeping face of the little baby. "Lord love it," she murmured, smiling, "what a darling little face." Mildred Tarnley looked down on it, too. She said nothing. She bit her lips hard, and her old eyes filled with tears that welled over as she surrendered the baby without a word, and then hastily she went out, mounted to her seat in the tax-cart, and was driven swiftly away by a companion as silent as he who had conveyed her there. End of Chapter 54. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 55 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 55. How Fares the Child? Dr. Willett called regularly at the Grange, and kind Lady Windale was daily there, taking the doctor's directions about jellies, wines, and such other good things as the depressed state of the patient called for, notwithstanding her fever. In a few days more he changed this treatment. The patient, in fact, could not be got to swallow these things. Dr. Willett became more perplexed. It was not exactly gastric fever, but he thought it more resembled that flickering, treacherous fire than any other fever with which he was acquainted. There are sicknesses that will not be cured through the body. The mind diseased, which is the parent of these impracticable maladies, of which when people die they are said to have died of a broken heart, disdains the apothecary's boxes and bottles, knows nothing of them. A heartache of which it is no more than an unusually protracted fit, has its seat in that which no apothecary can hear, see, feel, or understand. When the immortal, and in this life inscrutable spirit, which is the unseen lodger, the master of the body, sickens, all sickens. In its pain all below it writhe and wither, and the body, its ultimate expression, reflects but cannot mitigate its torment. Dr. Willett, too, complained that the child was ill, and that it must have been ill before it left the Grange. On this point he and Mildred Tarnley had a sharp battle. When both parties had cooled a little, he admitted that possibly the symptoms might not have been sufficiently developed to have excited the attention of an uninstructed observer. The Grange was growing all this time more awful. Death seemed to have made his abode there, and the shadow of the hearse plumes seemed to rest upon the windows. Courage flagged, despair supervened, and Mrs. Tarnley's temper grew all but insupportable. A day in such situations seems very long, and many had passed since the baby had made his journey to Twyford. The doctor seemed desponding, and stood longer silent by his patient's bed this day than usual. His questions were briefer, and he was less communicative than usual when he was going. Mildred Tarnley was making up her mind that the blow was inevitable, and was secretly wishing it might come soon, since come it must. The father buried but 2 months since, the mother sinking into an untimely grave, and the poor little baby also dying. Was this family accursed? What a blight was this! The doctor had said that he would return by Grice's mill. It had been dark some time, and was now about 7 o'clock. Tom was down at the forge, Dulcibella and Lily Dogger both upstairs, and she quite alone in the kitchen. She was more uncomfortable than she had ever been before about Alice that night. She had seen in the doctor's countenance that day, as he told her he would look in again on his return up the glen, that which had profoundly alarmed her. And now, sitting alone in this dark kitchen, she was infested by gloomy forebodings and terrible fancies. She went upstairs to the sick lady's door. At that hour no amendment was probable, and there certainly was none. Down again she went. The idea had got into her head that the patient would die that night, and she grew nervous and tired of listening for death watches, and picking incipient winding sheets off the candle. I wonder Master Harry doesn't come here, if 'twas only to ask whether his sister was dead or alive, and why old Willett don't come. Smelt out a good supper somewhere, and he's stuffing his gut, I'll warrant, while the poor lady's taking the rattles. Mildred Tarnley could take this no longer, and she went out and down the dark road that leads to the glen of Carwell, close by, down which, with the uselessness of impatience, she went to look for a sight of the absent doctor, and listen for the tread of his horse. Nothing cheered by that darksome walk, and the solemn and solitary view down the Carwell road, she stood gazing down toward distant Grice's mill until she tired of that too, and in dismay and bitterness retraced her steps toward the Grange. On entering the yard, she saw a man's figure approaching her from the kitchen door. She thought it was the doctor's for a moment, but it was not. And with a lord! Who's that? Gasped in fear that sounded like fury. She stood fixed as the old pump. "Ah, don't you know me, woman?" said Harry Fairfield, surlily. "I've only a few minutes. You'll have to come wi' me in the morning over to Twyford." "To Twyford?" "Aye, to Twyford, and why the devil do ye leave the yard door open? I walked into the kitchen and right up the stairs, looking for ye, and knocked at Alice's door. I think you're cracked. And what's to fear here down in the grange? Hoot! If 'tweren't for form's sake, we need never draw bolt from one Christmas to another. There was a woman found with her throat cut by the 3 pollards between this and Hatherton on Tuesday. If you like sit down here, 'tis little to me. I'll come here at 8 o'clock in the morning to fetch ye. Is the child sick? Not it was, but it's getting all right. That is, if it be the child. What the deal d'ye mean, Master Harry? I was looking at the child this morning, and damn me if I think it's the same child we left here, said Harry. Why, sir, Mr. Harry, what's this? I say I misdoubt it's not the same child, and ye must come over and look at it. Don't ye say a word of the matter to no one. No more did I. If you do, we'll never come to the bottom of it. My dear Lord, exclaimed old Mildred, turning paler and frowning very hard. I won't stop. I won't eat anything. I can't delay tonight. My nag's by the bridle there, beside the scales. And any message to Wickford? I'll be passing Willet's house. Well, well, repeated Mildred, gaping at him still, with scarcely a breath left her. Sin is sin, be it seen or no. Judgment follows. God has feet of wool and hands of iron. Sweep before your own door, lass. You're a bit daft, bain't ye? Said Harry with a sudden glare in his face. God forgive us all. Amen, said Harry. And there came a pause. Women and fools will be meddling, he resumed. Lord love ye, for mad cows deaf ears, they say. On my soul, 'twould make a cow laugh. And if ye don't mind, you may run your head against the wall. I will go tomorrow and look at the child, said Mildred, with sudden emphasis, clapping one lean hand down on the other. That's all I want ye. Come, what mischief can ye make of that? Clear your head. There's 2 things shouldn't anger ye. What ye can help and what ye can't, said Mildred. I'll go wi' ye in the morning, Master Harry. That's the least we can do, and the most. How's Allie? Dyin', I think. She'll be gone before daybreak, I'm thinking. That's bad, said Harry. Good hap or ill hap, as God awards. I know nowt against her. Poor little thing, said Harry. I blame myself, but what could I do? If aught's gone wrong wi' the child, poor lady, 'tis well she were gone too. There's many a fellow'd knock you on the head for less, replied Harry, with a very black look. You women has a hintin' funkin' way wi' ye. Ye like to ladle the drippin' over a fellow's legs, and say ye meant the mutton. Can't ye speak out, and say what ye mean, and get it off your stomach, and let me know, and I'll answer it straight like a man and a Fairfield, damn me. I'll go wi' ye tomorrow, and I take it that's what ye want. Well, this I'll say. If ye suppose I'd hurt that poor baby to the value of a pin's point, you're a stupider and wickeder witch than I took ye for, and I wish poor Allie could hear me, and I'd swear to her on my knees, at her dying bed, by the Creator that made me, that I'll work for that boy, as if he was my own, till I make him safe in Wyvern. And can't ye see, woman, damn ye, that I can have but the boy's good in my mind, when ask ye to come over on such an errand to Twyford? Well, I do suppose. 8 o'clock? And there's 2 feet will be cold air then. I'm afeard." "Don't be a fool no more, and I forgive ye, Mildred," said he, extending his hand. "And don't ye mind to lick wi' the rough side of my tongue. 'Tis a way wi' us Fairfields, and there wasn't many of 'em would ha' stood to let ye rile them as ye did me. And bolt your doors, mind. And poor Ally, I hope she may do yet. And mind ye, 8 o'clock sharp." So Harry departed. Mildred stood and looked after him for a time. "There's nothing ever goes right at the Grange," she said with a short, hard sigh. "Nor never did, nor never will." And after a pause, with another sigh, she said, "No, no, I won't think it. I couldn't think it. 'Tain't in one of them. They might be tickled wi' a lass, or hot-tempered wi' a man, and a bit too hard wi' tongue or hand. But the like of that, I can't believe it, never. And I wish I hadn't a heard that. I'm most sure I heard the child cry in the loft there. I'm sorry I didn't say so then. I don't know why, and I don't know now, what it should be no more than another. But I didn't like it. It looked like somewhat hid, I can't say, but my heart misgave me." Old Mildred walked into the house. She had other thoughts now than the poor lady upstairs. They were remorseful, though. She could hardly say for what she could blame herself. Perhaps she overrated her authority, and fancied she could have prevented the baby's being taken away. But it might be all quite right. Men were so stupid about babies. A pretty hand a Fairfield man would make of a nursery. At all events, the morrow would clear a great deal up. The morning came. The doctor had looked in, and, as often happened, had surprised the lookers-on by pronouncing positively that the patient was not worse. With a qualm at her heart, Mildred asked him when he had seen the child, and watched his face hard, while he answered quite frankly that he had seen it the day before, that it was decidedly better, and it might possibly do well. When should he see it again? There was nothing alarming. Probably tomorrow. Certainly not later than the next day. There was nothing urgent. The chances were rather in favor of its recovery, but of course there were the risks, and we weren't to holla till we were out of the wood. With this cheer Mildred was much comforted, so much reassured that when 8 o'clock came next morning and brought no Harry Fairfield, she felt rather relieved of a bore than disappointed. 2 days later Dr. Willett reported more favorably than he had yet done on Alice. His account of the boy, however, was by no means so cheery. Harry looked in still later, and talked the matter over with Mildred. "I thought, ye see, I might just be making a fool of myself, and another o' you. So I went over there quietly next day, and I'm sure it was a mistake. The child's thinner a deal, and its colour gone, and it was dark almost when I saw it, and she held the candle too low, and cast a shadow from its nose, by Jove, across its face. You never see so queer a monkey as it looked, and so I held my tongue, but made over here to put our heads together and make sure the matter. But when I went next day and saw it in the daylight, by Jove, it was all right. The child, and no mistake. But it is grown awful thin and wry-faced. Only you couldn't take it for any other. And the doctor sees it every second day, and I'm glad to hear that poor little Alice is getting on so well. She'll be on her legs again in no time, I'm thinking." After Harry had gone, Dr. Willett arrived, with a very ill account of the baby. Dying, poor little thing, its heart wrong, and all the organs. But you mustn't tell Mrs. Fairfield. It may cost her her life if she begins to fret about it. And just tell her it's quite well, for it's true, you know. It's nearer heaven, and best of all when it gets there. So tell her when she asks that it was sent in charge of careful people to get it out of the reach of the infection that is in the neighborhood, and keep her mind quiet. A few days later the news of its death arrived in the kitchen, and Lily Dogger, who was afraid to give way to her emotions before Mrs. Tarnley, abruptly rose and ran out, and throwing her apron over her head, broke into absolute screams of crying under the great old trees that stood by the scales. Here there was a sad secret to disclose when the time came, and poor Alice was strong enough to bear the story. In the meantime, Harry Fairfield came and had a stormy interview with old Mildred. The doctor, he swore, didn't know his business. The women at Twyford had neglected the child. He'd see to it. He'd be a devil among the tailors. He'd open their eyes to them. He had often got £50 for a less neglect of a filly. They should smoke all round for it. And there now was Wyvern without an heir. For, damn him, if he'd ever marry, he wouldn't for St. Peter. It wouldn't do, it wouldn't be, at no price. And there was old Wyvern, and never a Fairfield, to see tankard filled or faggot fired in the old house. Harry was not married, although he had insinuated some matrimonial ambiguities in his talk with old Mildred. But I believe he swore truly when he vowed that he never would marry. He had quite made up his mind on that point for some time. For the rest, his threatenings ended in the noise they began in. In truth, there was no ground for complaint, and both nurse and doctor had done their duty. Alice recovered. I do not attempt to describe the long morning that followed, the sweet, the bitter, and the terrible recollections that ever after tinted the image of Carwell Grange in her memory. As soon as she could bear removal to her kind kinswoman, Lady Windale insisted on taking her to Noulton. After a time they travelled, and finally returned to Noulton, where they lived on together in the happiness of great and tried affection. A difference of 35 years did not separate them any more than the interval of a generation did Naomi and Ruth. Lady Windale being one of those gifted women in whom the girlish spirit burns high and bright, so long as life itself continues, full of sympathy and gaiety, with a strong vein of romance, and a pleasant sense of the ridiculous, and also fine, immovable affections, was to one who had suffered calamities so dire as had befallen Alice Fairfield, a more delightful companion than any of her own age could have been. For when it was needed, there was the graver charm of a long and sad experience, and there were also the grander teachings of religion, and these were not obtruded or vaunted in any wise, but rather toned her thoughts and feelings, with their peculiar, sublime, and melancholy thoughts, in which all things are subdued and also glorified. End of chapter 55. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 56 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 56. The Old Squire Leaves Wyvern. The old folk can't go on living always. The king's messenger had called at Wyvern, and the old squire must needs get up and go. Sickness was a cross he had never been used to bear, and now that it was laid on his old shoulders, he knew that he could not keep his feet very long. He had the Wyvern lawyer who did the business of the estate up to his room, and the parson, and his own son, Harry Fairfield. He made the attorney read the will, which he had told him to bring up with him, and the squire listened as it was read slowly. After the clergyman had gone, "Have ye aught to say to that, son Harry?" said the old squire. "'Tis an old will, father," said Harry. "It ain't," said the squire. 8 years less 2 months, said the lawyer. "About the age rum's fit to drink," said the old squire. "What say ye to it? Now's your time, son. Priests, women, and poultry, they say, has never enough. There's been changes since, and I don't see why Wyvern should be charged so heavy." "There's 300 a year to Alice. That's what ye mean?" said the old squire. His son was silent. "Well, I don't owe her nothing, that's true, but I'll let it stand, mind. And, Harry, lad, the day ye do a good thing, there will be 7 new moons. What was parson a-whispering about in the window wi' ye?" he asked of the attorney after a time. "Some claim upon the vicarage, which he thought you said you meant to remit by will." "I thought upon it, and I won't. Paternoster built our churches, and our father pulled 'em down. There's o'er many parsons for the churches, and o'er many churches for the people. Tell him I won't." "What the devil made you talk about that to him?" said Harry, with a dark look, when he and the attorney had got out of the room. "My dear sir," said the lawyer, "we must be true to our clients. And beside, don't you remember the clergyman said he'd be here tomorrow at 1 to administer the Lord's Supper, and he'll be certain to speak of it then to our client." At nightfall the squire grew worse, and his head wandered. "Tell that white-faced vicar Maybell there's never a one but the thankless in hell. I'll not sit under none o' his sermons. Aye, he frowns at that." "Hey, dear," whispered the housekeeper, gazing at him from the hearth where they were sitting. "And who does he mean, ma'am?" asked the nurse. "God knows. Old times, I suppose," she answered. "There's a glass broke, Tom. Who's kicking up the row?" mumbled the squire. "Play, women, and wine undoes men, laughing." "Aye, light it. I'm very dark." "Who's he, ye fool?" "Joan and my ladies, all one in the dark." "That's Tom Ward he's thinking on," said the nurse. "Aye, he liked Tom ever. He wouldn't think 'twas Wyvern without Tom," answered the housekeeper. In a little time he said more distinctly and sternly, "The dead should do nothing. So that's the bishop. Aye, aye, the devil, mind ye, isn't always at one door. If there was a good man here, he'd put a clout over that face. Ye'll never do it." Then it would sink into mumbling, and then again grow more distinct. At last the morning came, and the squire, so many hours nearer death, was nevertheless now like himself. In due course the clergyman arrived, and the housekeeper and serious Jim Hopper of the mill close by attended to make up a little congregation, with whom the dying squire was to receive the most comfortable sacrament before setting out on his long journey. "You're distinctly a Church of England man?" inquired the clergyman gently. "Aye, what do you take me for? I make it a rule, dear sir, to inquire." I have once or twice found Presbyterians and other dissenters among the attendants at my church at Nottingham before I came here, and I am happy to hear so clear an answer to my inquiry," said the clergyman with a gracious solemnity. "The crow thinks her own bird fairest. Go on," said Squire Harry. After these rites were over, the squire needed rest. Then, after an hour or so, he called for Tom Ward. "Well, Tom, we ha' lived a long while together here in Wyvern, you and me, and, be the day never so long, at last cometh evensong, as they say, and now the doctor thinks my time be come, and I sent for ye to shake hands, Tom, and bid ye good-bye." Tom was drying his eyes hastily, and his old face was more puckered than ever. "Your honour was always kind to me." "Come, Tom, you mustn't be crying, man. Penny in pocket's a merry companion, and I wrote ye down for something in my will. And ye ha' brewed me many a tankard, Tom. Ye'll never brew me another, and I wouldn't go without a word and a shake by the hand." When this was over, the nurse signed to Tom to go. I wonder how the grim old man, with near a week's white stubble on his chin, felt as he saw Tom Ward glide away softly, with tears on his rugged cheeks. For Tom it was the breaking up and foundering of old Wyvern in the deep. He was too old to live in the new Wyvern that was coming, mayhap. "I'll never get the old days out of my head, nor ever like the new, and 'twon't be long, I'm thinking, before I follow him down the ash tree road to Wyvern churchyard." And so for the old squire it came, the last day of light, and the first of death. It was a stately funeral in the old-fashioned way. All the good old houses of the county were represented there. The neighbours, great and small, mustered. The shops in the town were all shut, and the tenants attended in masses. This solemn feast and pageant over, the fuss subsided, and Harry entered upon his reign with a gravity becoming his new prerogative and responsibilities. Sergeant Major Archdale was an influential and prosperous and reserved minister under the new regime. He had a snug berth at Warhampton, as Harry Fairfield had promised, and from that distant legation he was summoned every now and then to Wyvern, and there conferred with the squire. I have called him Sergeant Major, but he was so no longer. He had retired some time before from the militia, and was now plain Mr. Archdale. End of chapter 56. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 57 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 57. Marjory Trevellian. In order to throwing a light upon the nature of some of the duties of Mr. Archdale, we must convey the reader in spirit to some little distance. In the sequestered country, about 12 miles south of Twyford, in a pretty nook formed by a wooded hollow close by the old by-road to Warhampton, stands an antique cottage, with a loft and 2 little windows peeping through the very steep thatched roof, and high, narrow gable and wall alike streaked and crossed with those black oak beams which form the cage into whose interstices our ancestors built their brick and plaster. The steep roof runs out over a little porch which has a bench on one side of it. Another stone bench stands under the lattice window, the woodwork of which casement, as well as the black spars crossed and mortised in the walls, and even the curved black chimney, look shrunk and warped by time, by which too the hatch at the door is rounded and furrowed, and the stone seat and window stones worn into curves and hollows, and such and so venerable is the air of the structure, with its ivy-bound porch, that one might fancy it the very farmhouse in which Anne Hathaway passed her girlhood. Here dwelt good Mrs. Marjory Trevellian, some 50 years old and upward, with, I think, the kindest face and pleasantest laugh in that part of the country, a widow of many years, not very happy in her marriage, and quite content with her experience of the wedded state. Quiet, cheerful, very industrious, with a little farm of 3 acres and a cow, spinning sometimes, knitting at others, and when she could, taking in washing, and in all things approving herself diligent, cheerful, and honest. With this kind, cheery, honest dame lived a little boy, the son of a Mr. Henry. That was all she knew distinctly about his people. She called him her fairy and her prince, and when curious people questioned her closely, she said that his father was a merchant, unfortunate in business, as the phrase is, that he was living perhaps in concealment and in distressed circumstances, or possibly was dead. All she could say for certain was that she received a small allowance for maintaining him, which was paid punctually every 3 months in advance, and that as to the name of the boy, his Christian name was William, and his surname Henry, and that she called him her prince, or her fairy, and he called her Granny. She idolized this pretty boy, and he loved her with the tenderness which a child bestows upon a loving nurse, something more than filial. The boy remembers no other home but this, and no other friend but Granny. He was now a little past 11. His life had been solitary but cheerful. Was there not the pond only 30 yards away from their doorstep, in which he sailed his fleet of ships made of corks, which old Peter Durden gave him? He was a cousin of Marjory Trevellian's, and lived in the village 2 miles away. He used to call every Sunday, and to bring these corks in his pocket, and a bit of such lead as tea is wrapped in, to make the keels of their navy. He was dressed in a blue swallow-tailed coat with brass buttons. His drab trousers were very short, his stockings faded sky blue, and his shoes clumsy and clouded and highly polished. He wore a chestnut wig of a long and lank cut, and his forehead slanted back very much, and his nose came forward, and a perpetual smile expanded his cheeks, which were as red and smooth as a ripe apple. His countenance was not very wise, though very good-natured, rather silly, I'm afraid, and I think he took more interest in this sort of shipping than was quite compatible with strength of mind. As these ships glided with thin paper sails across the pond, while Master Henry watched them in grave absorption, Peter's raptures expressed themselves in continuous peals of laughter. These were great occasions in the solitary life of Fairy. There were a set of big boxwood 9-pins, skittles, I suppose, with balls, battered and discolored. I never knew how they got into the cottage, but they looked 100 years old, if a day. Many a game with these on the smooth patch of sward on the other side of the pond had pleasant old Marjory with her darling. In its seclusion, its life was monastic, but not in its liberty. The boy was on the whole very happy. Looking on honest Marjory as mistress of all she surveyed, it never struck him that in the points in which her dietary differed from his, she was practicing a compulsory economy. The article of meat was not often found in her bill of fare, but conscientiously she placed the little fellow's bit of broiled meat before him every day, and told him when he inquired why she had none for herself, that she did not like it, and that it did not agree with her, which he accepted as undoubted truths, and wondered and regretted secretly. On winter evenings their tea was very cosy. A wheaten cake, baked on the griddle, a new-laid egg each, and a cup of tea from the many-colored Delft teapot, a good deal burnt on the side next the fire. With the door barred and the window carefully closed, the fire burning cheerfully, and their candle lighting the party, who so happy? And was there not the old Robinson Crusoe, with binding black with age, and a frontispiece showing the hero with his grave countenance and beard, his tall cap and goatskin dress, his musket over one shoulder, and his umbrella over the other, and recounting his marvelous life in the quaint old type of Queen Anne? And was there not that other literary treasure, the old folio volume of Captain Cook's, Commodore Anson's, and other seafaring worthies' voyages round and up and down the world, with no end of careful old copper plates, showing Pacific islands, curious volcanoes, flotillas of armed canoes, thick-lipped miscreants with rings in their noses and birds' tails enlivening their foreheads, and long processions of official people, priests, etc., with a small white pocket handkerchief each, by way of dress. But better far than these, which together with her Bible and prayer book constituted Marjory's library, was that good creature's inexhaustible collection of fairy tales, received traditionally and recounted viva voce, and prefaced with the rhyme which even at this distance recalls me to the nursery fireside, with the far-off tones of a kindly voice that I shall hear no more. Once upon a time there was a king and a queen, as many have been, but few I have seen, except in pictures. And starting with this little trumpeting and summons to attention, the ois, 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 an immutable prelude of an ever-varying sequel, good Marjory, the herald of ever-new wonders, would tell her tale of dwarfs and castles, of godmother fairies and malignant enchantresses, broken-hearted princes and persecuted princesses, and enchanted palaces and awful forests, till the hour came for the little fellow to get to his bed and enter the no less wonderful land of dreams. Another person who contributed to the regular entertainment of the boy was Tom Orange. Tom Orange called at the cottage sometimes at intervals of 3 months, sometimes for perhaps half a year, on the first of each month, and was always made welcome by Marjory Trevellian, and feasted with rashers, and whatever else her humble larder afforded, and on going had established a mysterious right to a shilling tip, which he always made it a point should be an honorable secret among them. What might be the nature of his business the little boy neither knew nor cared, but Tom Orange was in the boy's eyes the ideal and epitome of all that was enchanting, brilliant, and exhilarating. Tom was somewhat long and lean, with a face also long and always smiling, except when it was making a grimace, an art in which he excelled almost every other blackguard I have heard of. His clothes and hat were seedy, and for so merry a person, he was wonderfully poor. Tom Orange's accomplishments were infinite. He could dance a hornpipe with all the well-known airs and graces of a sailor. He could protrude his mouth till it assumed a shape quite unknown to physiognomists, and, with a delicate finger turning his eyelids inside out, make the pupils of those organs quiver strangely, while he uttered a sound like the call of a jackdaw. He could sing a variety of comic songs, with refrains delivered with a volubility which distanced admiration, and made his very audience breathless, and some of these were relieved with occasional dialogue of matchless character and humor. He could swallow any number of pennies you pleased, and take them all out at different angles of his body. He could put several potatoes under his hat, and withdraw them all without touching either the hat or the potatoes. He could keep 3 balls always in the air together, and he could balance 2 chairs upon his chin. In short, as I have said, his accomplishments were innumerable and extraordinary, and the only wonder was how so universal a genius could possibly possess so few shillings, and so many seedy articles of dress. Tom Orange, too, was great at skittles, and gave his pupil wonderful new lights. He taught him also how to guard, stop, and strike according to the principles of the noble art of self-defense. In fact, it would have been difficult to discover a more fascinating companion and instructor of youth. Possibly it was as well, however, that his visits were so far between, and as brief as fortune ordained them to be. It was no wonder, however, that these visits were looked for by the boy, as the return of the life and excitement of an annual fair might have been by the ingenuous youth of some other rural district. There was but one point on which Marjory was obliged to impose a prohibition upon the child. It seemed a trifle, but in reality was a gigantic privation. "No, darling, you mustn't talk to any other boys, nor play with them, nor go near them. If you do, you'll be took away by your friends, and I'll never see you again. And what will poor Granny do then without her darling?" And Granny's eyes filled with tears, and the boy cried and hugged her passionately, and this little agony gave place to wild affection and a glow of unspeakable delight and happiness, and was celebrated by a hot cake that evening, and new-laid eggs, and a great tea, and stories to no end. And she found her darling that night, crying in his sleep, and was sure he was dreaming of leaving the old cottage. And she wakened him with kisses, herself crying. So these 2 persons, notwithstanding some disparity of years, were wonderfully happy in one another's society, and if they had each their will, would have fixed things as they were, and neither grown older nor younger, but just gone on living so forever. End of chapter 57. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 58 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 58. The Enchanted Garden. Marjory Trevellian was what is accounted among her class a good scholar, and she had taught the little boy to read and write, to say his tables, and to cipher, as she termed the initiatory arithmetical exercises. It was plain, however, that the boy was not abandoned to chance, but that an eye was upon him, and some friendly, if not conscientious, direction controlling his destiny. In one of his visits, Tom Orange handed her a letter written in the same neat clerk's hand, in which the short memorandum that accompanied each remittance was penned, Having read the letter, she was thoughtful. When Tom had gone away, she said, "You are to be taught like a gentleman, as you are, my darling. And you're not to be sent to school for 3 or 4 years. And in the meantime, Mr. Wharton, he's a kind, good gentleman, is to teach you for 2 hours every evening after the school is over. You know his house. It is about a mile away from this, just halfway on the road to the grammar school." "But I'm to live at home, Granny, all the same?" inquired the boy in great trepidation. "Lord love it, to be sure he is," beaming on him with great affection. "Only 2 hours, and everyone likes Mr. Wharton, and I'm desired to go to his house to take his orders tomorrow." So she did, and the new order of things was established with very little disturbance of the old. The narrow road which the boy every afternoon passed to and from Dr. Wharton's house makes about halfway a sudden curve. It is a wooded road, not without little ups and downs, and formidable ruts, and blocks of worn old stone, so large as to shock all the rules of modern road-making. Upon this curve, so as nearly to front the boy's line of march, is a very old fruit garden, with a discolored ivy-grown wall, on which are growing moss and houseleek, and here and there tufts of grass and wallflower. Over the wall are seen ancient standard plum and cherry and pear trees, and beyond them the upper windows, and the steep grey roof and slender chimneys of a house as much out of date as the garden. In the garden wall is a tall door with worn fluted pilasters, corresponding in antiquity with the rest of the building and its belongings. This stone framework has an iron door, old-fashioned and fancifully wrought into arabesques of spikes, leaves, and stars, facing the quiet road, and within this a strong wooden door. Fruit trees are, of course, always interesting to boys, but quite another interest mingled in the feeling with which little Willie viewed such glimpses of the old grey house, and its background of dark and towering timber, as his approach afforded, and he often wished, as he passed, that a hole in the wall might afford him a peep into the old garden, and a glimpse of its owners. He sometimes heard their voices. A clear, childish laugh he had heard more than once from among the tall fruit trees and climbing roses that overtopped the wall, and a sweet female voice, also faintly prattling with the child. One evening, as he returned from Dr. Wharton's, with his books buckled in his strap swinging from his hand, having slackened his pace as usual, when he found himself under the garden wall, to his infinite delight the inner wooden door, which had always obstructed his curiosity, was open. The outer gate of iron walls and foliage was locked, but through its bars he could see at last the garden. Its trees were old and overgrown. It was wonderfully dark, with roses and other flowers growing here and there, and one straight walk leading up to the house, and continuing the line of the narrow bridge, which at the iron door crossed what seemed a sort of moat, whose banks were overgrown with docks and nettles. He could see part of the steps leading up to the door of the house, and a portion of one of its windows. The rest was concealed by the thick foliage, and the effect of this little glimpse was increased by the deep shadow of the foreground. It was not very far from sunset, and the small birds were already singing among the boughs, and the deep shadow, the antique and neglected air, and the silence of the place gave it in his romantic eyes, a character of monastic mystery and enchantment. As he gazed straight up the dark walk towards the house, suddenly a man turned the corner of the yew hedge that met the bridge's parapet close to him, and walking straight up to the door, with a gruff look at the little boy, shut and locked the wooden door in his face. So all was gone for the present. He knew there was no good in looking through the keyhole, for envious fortune had hung a spray of sweetbriar, so as effectually to intercept the view, and nothing remained but the dingy, chocolate-coloured planks before him and the foliage and roses trembling over the old wall. Many a time again he passed and repassed the door without a like good hap. At length, however, one evening he found the envious wooden door once more open, and the view again disclosed through the iron bars. A very pretty little girl with golden hair was standing on tiptoe near, and with all her soul was striving to reach an apple with a stick, which she held in her tiny fingers. Seeing him, she fixed her large eyes on him and said, with an air of command, "Come and climb up the tree and get me that apple." His heart beat quick. There was nothing he liked better. "But I can't get in," he said, blushing. "The door's locked." "Oh, I'll call Mamma. She'll let you in. Don't you know Mamma?" "No, I never saw her," answered the boy. "Wait there, and I'll fetch her." And so she was gone. The first flutter of his excitement was hardly over when he heard steps and voices near, and a little girl returned, holding the hand of a slight pale lady with a very pretty face, dressed all in black. She had the key in her hand, and smiled gently on the little boy as she approached. Her face was kind, and at once he trusted her. "Oh, he has left the inner door open again," she said, and with a little nod and smile of welcome she opened the door, and the boy entered the garden. Both doors were now shut. "Look up, little boy," said the lady in black, with a very sweet voice. She liked his face. He was a very handsome little fellow, and with an expression earnest, shy, and bright, and the indescribable character of refinement, too, in his face. She smiled more kindly still, and placing just the tip of her finger under his chin, she said, "You are a gentleman's son, and you are nicely dressed. What is your name?" "My papa's name is Mr. Henry," he answered. "And where do you go to school?" "I don't go to school. I say lessons to Mr. Wharton, about half a mile from this." "It is great fun, I suppose, playing with the little boys, cricket and all that?" "I'm not allowed to play with the little boys." "Who forbids you?" "My friends won't allow me." "Who are your friends? I never saw them." "Really? And don't you live with your papa?" "No, I live with Marjory." "Do you mean with your mamma?" "Oh, no, she died a long time ago." "And is your papa rich? Why aren't you with him?" "He was rich, Granny says." "But he grew poor." "And where is he now?" "I don't know." "I'm to go to school," he said, acquiring confidence the more he looked in that sweet face. "My friends will send me in 3 years, Granny says." "You're a very nice little boy, and I'm sure a good little fellow. We'll have tea in a few minutes. You must stay and drink tea with us." The little fellow held his straw hat in his hand, and was looking up in the face of the lady, whose slender fingers were laid almost caressingly on his rich brown hair, as she looked down smiling, with eyes in which the water stood. Perhaps these forlorn childhoods had a peculiar interest for her. and it is very polite of you taking off your hat to a lady. But put it on again, for I am not a bit better than you. And I'll go and tell them to get tea now. Dulcibella, she called. Dulcibella, this little friend is coming to drink tea with us, and Amy and he will play here till it comes. And don't mind getting up. Sit quiet and rest yourself. And she signed with her hand, smiling, to repress her attempt to rise. Well, darling, play in sight of me, till your mamma comes back, said the rheumatic old woman, addressing the little girl. And ye mustn't be pulling at that great rolling stone. Ye can't move it, and ye may break your pretty back trying. With these and similar injunctions, the children were abandoned to their play. He found this pretty young lady imperious, but it was pleasant to be commanded, and the little boy climbed trees to gather her favorite apples, and climbed the garden wall to pluck a bit of wallflower, and at last she said, Now we'll play 9 pins. There's the box. Set them up on the walk. Yes, that's right. You have played. Who taught you? Granny? Has Granny 9 pins? Yes, ever so much bigger than these. Really? So Granny is rich then? I think so. As rich as Mamma? Her garden isn't so big. Begin, do you? Aha! You've hit one, and who plays best? Tom Orange does. Does your Mamma know Tom Orange? I dare say she does. Dulcibella, does Mamma know Tom Orange? No, my dear. No, she doesn't, echoed the little girl. Who is he? What? Not know Tom Orange? How could that be? So he narrated on that brilliant theme. Tom Orange must come to tea with Mamma. I'll tell her to ask him, decided the young lady. So these little wiseacres pursued their game, and then had their tea. And in about an hour, the little boy found himself trudging home with a sudden misgiving, for the first time, as to the propriety of his having made these acquaintances without Granny's leave. The kind voice, the beloved smile of Granny received him before the cottage door. Welcome, darlin'. And where was my darlin', and what kept him from his old Granny? So they hugged and kissed, and then he related all that had happened, and asked, Was it any harm, Granny? Not a bit, darlin'. That's a good lady, and a grand lady, and a fit companion for ye. And see how she knew the gentle blood in your pretty face? And ye may go, as she has asked you, tomorrow evening again, and as often as she asks ye. For it was only the little fellows that's going about without edication or manners that your friends, and who can blame them, doesn't like ye to keep company with. And who'd blame them, seeing they're seldom out of mischief, and that's the beginning of wickedness. And you're going, but, oh, darlin', not for 3 long years, thank God, to a grand school, where there's none but the best. So this chance acquaintance grew, and the lady seemed to take every week a deeper interest in the fine little boy, so sensitive, generous, and intelligent, and he very often drank tea with his new friends. End of Chapter 58. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 59 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 59. An Old Friend. I'm going now to describe the occurrences of a particular evening on which my young friend drank tea at Stanlake Farm, which was the name of the house with the old garden to which I have introduced the reader. A light shower had driven the party in from the garden, and so the boy and Amy were at their ninepins in the great hall, when the door being open, a gentleman rode up and dismounted, placing the bridle in the hand of a groom who accompanied him. A tall man he was, with whiskers and hair dashed with white and a slight stoop. He strode into the hall, his hat on, and a whip still in his hand. "Hullo! So there you are, and how is your ladyship?" said he. "Skittles by the law. Bravo! 2 down, by Jove. I'd rather that young man took you in hand than I. And tell me, where's Allie?" "Mamma's in the drawing-room," said the young lady, scarcely regarding his presence. "Now play. It's your turn," she said, addressing her companion. The new arrival looked at the boy and paused till he threw the ball. "That's devilish good, too," said the stranger. "Very near the 9, eh? But a miss is as good as a mile, and I don't think he's quite as good as you. And she's in the drawing-room? Which is the drawing-room?" "Don't you know the drawing-room? Well, there it is." And the young lady indicated it with her finger. "My turn now." And while the game was pursued in the hall, the visitor pushed open the drawing-room door and entered. "And how is Miss Allie?" "Oh, Harry, really!" "Myself as large as life. You don't look half pleased, Allie. But I have nought but good news for you today. You're something richer this week than you were last." "What is it, Harry? Tell me what you mean." "So I will. You know that charge on Carwell, £140 a year? Well, that's dropped in. That old witch is dead. You might have seen it in the newspaper, if you'd taken one. Bertha Velderkaust. No love lost between ye, eh?" "Oh, Harry, Harry, don't," said poor Alice, pale and looking intensely pained. "Well, I won't then. I didn't think 'twould vex you. Only you know what a head devil that was, and she's dead in the old place, Hoxton. I read the inquest in the Times. She was always drinking. I think she was a bit mad. She and the people in the back room were always quarrelling, and the father's up for that, and forgery. But 'twasn't clear how it came about. Some swore she was out of her mind with drink and pitched herself out of the window. And some thought it might have been that chap as went in to rob her, thinking she was stupid. And so there was a tussle for it. She was main strong, you know, and he chucked her out. Anyhow, she got it awful, for she fell across the spikes of the area rails, and she hung on them with 3 lodged in her side. The mad dog fox she was." "Oh, Harry, how shocking!" "Oh, pray don't," exclaimed Alice, who looked as if she was going to faint. "Well, she lay there without breath enough to screech, twisting like a worm for 3 hours, it's thought." "Oh, Harry, pray don't describe it. Don't, I implore. I feel so ill." "Well, I won't, if you say so. Only she's smashed and cold in her wooden surtout, and her charge is reverted to you now, and I thought I'd tell ye." "Thank you, Harry," she said very faintly. "And when did you come here?" "I only heard this morning," asked Harry. 5 weeks ago. Do you like it? Ain't it plaguey lonesome?" "I like the quiet, at least for a time," she answered. "And I'm thinking of getting married. Upon my soul, I am." "What do you think of that?" "Really? Sure as you're there, but it won't be none of your love matches. Bring something, lass, along wi' thee, if thou intend to live wi' me. That's my motto. Sweetheart and honeybird keeps no house, I've heard say. I like a body that can look after things, and that would rather fund £50 than spend 100. A nice wife and a back door hath made many a rich man poor. As they say, and besides, I'm not a young fellow no longer. I'm pushing 60, and I should be wise. And who's the little chap who's playing skittles wi' Annie in the hall? Oh, that's such a nice little boy. His father's name is Henry, and his mother's been dead a long time. He lives with a good old woman named Marjory Trevellian. What's the matter, Harry? Nothing. I beg your pardon. I was thinking of something else, and I didn't hear. Tell me now, and I'll listen. So she repeated her information, and Harry yawned and stretched his arms. For want of company, welcome trumpery. And I must be going now. I wouldn't mind drinking a glass of sherry, as you're so pressing, for I've had a stiff ride and dust drouthy. So Harry, having completed his visit, characteristically took his leave and mounted his nag, and rode away. End of chapter 59. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 60 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 60, Tom Orange. Little Miss Amy had a slight cold, and the next tea party was put off for a day. On the evening following Harry's visit at Stanlake Farm, Marjory Trevellian, being at that time absent in the village to make some frugal purchases, who should suddenly appear before the little boy's eyes, as he lifted them from his fleet upon the pond, but his friend, Tom Orange, as usual in high and delightful spirits. Need I say how welcome Tom was? He asked in a minute or two for Marjory, and took her temporary absence with great good humour. Tom affected chilliness, and indeed the evening was a little sharp, and proposed that they should retire to the cottage and sit down there. How soon do you suppose, youngster, the old hen will come home? Who? Marjory Daw down the chimney. Oh, Granny? This nickname was the only pleasantry of Mr. Orange, which did not quite please the boy. Tom Orange had interpolated his performance of the jackdaw, with his eyelids turned inside out and the pupils quivering, which, although it may possibly have resembled the jackdaw of heraldry, was not an exact portraiture of the bird familiar to us in natural history. And when this was over, he asked again, "How soon will she be home?" "She walked down to the town, and I think she can't be more than about halfway back again. That's a mile, and 3 miles an hour is the best of her paces, if she was running for a pound of sausages and a new cap. Hi-ho, and alas and alack-a-day! No one at home but the maid, and the maid's gone to church. I wrote her a letter the day before yesterday, and I must read it again before she comes back. Where does she keep her letters?" "In her work-box, on the shelf." "This will be it. The very identical fiddle," said Tom Orange playfully. Setting it down upon the little deal table, and opening it, he took out the little sheaf of letters from the end, and took them one by one to the window, where he took the liberty of reading them. I think he was disappointed, for he pitched them back again into their nook in the little trunk-shaped box, contemptuously. The boy regarded Tom Orange as a friend of the family, so confidential, and as a man in all respects so admirable and virtuous, that nothing appeared more desirable and natural than that excellent person's giving his attention to the domestic correspondence. He popped the box back again in its berth. Then he treated the young gentleman to Lingo's song, with the ragtag merry-derry periwig and hatband, etc., and at the conclusion of the performance admitted that he was dry, and with a pleasant wink and the tip of his finger pushing the end of his nose a good deal to the left. He asked him whether he could tell him where Mrs. Trevellian, who would be deeply grieved if she thought that Tom was detained for a drink till her return, kept her liquor. "Yes, I can show you," said the boy. "Wait a minute, my guide, my comforter and friend," said Tom Orange, and he ascertained from the door-stone that no one was inconveniently near. The boy was getting a teacup off the shelf. "Never mind sugar, my hero. I'll sweeten it with a thought of Marjory Daw." The boy explained and led him into the dark nook by the hall door. Tom Orange, well pleased, moved almost on tiptoe and looked curiously and spoke under his breath, and he groped in this twilight. "Here it is," said the boy frankly. "Where?" "Here." "This?" said Tom, for his friend had uncovered a crock of water. Tom Orange glared at him and at the water with grotesque surprise, and the bona fides of the boy and the simplicity of the situation struck Tom comically, and exploding good-humoredly, he sat down in Marjory's chair and laughed hilariously. Having satisfied himself by a confidential dialogue that Marjory Daw had no private bottle of comfort anywhere, this agreeable fellow so far forgot his thirst that he did not mind drawing water from the crock, and talked on a variety of subjects to the young gentleman. In the course of this conversation he asked him 2 topographical questions. One was, "Did you ever hear of a place called Carwell Grange?" And the other resembled it. "Did you ever hear of a place called Wyvern?" "No." "Think, lad, did you ever hear Mrs. Trevellian speak of Wyvern or of Carwell Grange?" "No." "Because there is the tallest mushroom you ever saw in your life growing there, and it has grown to that degree that it blocks the door, so that the squire can't get into his own house, and the mushroom is counted one of the wonders of the world, upon my little word of honour as a gentleman. And, since there's neither drink nor victuals, suppose, my lord, we play at skittles. And if she's not back by the end of the game, tell her I had to go onto the bridge to see lame Bill Withershins, and I'll be back again this evening, I think, or in the morning at latest." The game was played, but Marjory did not appear, and Tom Orange, entertaining his young friend with a ludicrous imitation of Bill Withershin's knock-knees, took his departure, leaving his delighted companion in the state which Moore describes as being usual, when the lamp that lighted the traveller at first goes out. So, having watched Tom till he was quite out of sight, he returned to his neglected navy on the pond, and delivered his admirable Crichton's message to Marjory Daw on her return. End of chapter 60. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 61 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 61. The Hour and the Man. Supper time came, and Tom Orange did not return. Darkness closed over the old cottage, the poplar trees, and the town, and the little boy said his prayers under the superintendence of worthy Marjory, and went to his bed. He was disturbed in his sleep by voices talking in the room. He could only keep his eyes open for a little time, and he saw Tom Orange talking with Mammy. He was at one side of the little table, and she at another, and his head was leaning forward, so as to approach uncomfortably near to the mutton fat, with a long snuff in the middle. Mammy, as he indiscriminately called Granny, was sobbing bitterly into her apron, and sometimes with streaming eyes speaking so low that he could not hear, to Tom Orange. Interesting as was the scene, slumber stole him away, and when he next wakened, Tom was gone, and Mammy was sitting on the bed, crying as if her heart would break. When he opened his eyes, she said, "Oh, darlin', darlin', my man, my own blessed man, my darlin'," and she hugged him to her heart. He remembered transports similar when 2 years ago he was very ill of a fever. "I'm not sick, Mammy, indeed. I'm quite well." And with these assurances and many caresses, he again fell asleep. In the morning his Sunday clothes, to his wonder, were prepared for him to put on. The little old faded crimson carpet-bag, which she had always told him, to the no small content of his self-importance, was his own, stood plump and locked on the little table under the clock. His chair was close beside Mammy's. She had all the delicacies he liked best for his breakfast. There was a thin little slice of fried bacon, and a new-laid egg, and a hot cake and tea. Quite a grand breakfast. Mammy sat beside him very close. Her arm was round him. She was very pale. She tried to smile at his prattle, and her eyes filled up as often as she looked at him, or heard him speak. Now and then he looked wonderingly in her face, and she tried to smile her old smile and nodded, and swallowed down some tea from her cup. She made belief of eating her breakfast, but she could not. When the wondering little man had ended his breakfast, with her old kind hands she drew him towards her. "Sit down on my lap, my precious, my own man, my beautiful boy, my own angel bright. Oh, darlin', darlin', darlin'." And she hugged the boy to her heart and sobbed over his shoulder as if her heart was bursting. He remembered that she cried the same way when the doctor said he was safe and sure to recover. "Mammy," he said, kissing her, "Amy has birthdays, and I think this is my birthday. Is it?" "No, darlin', no, no," she sobbed, kissing him. "No, my darlin', no. Oh, no, 'tain't that." She got up hastily and brought him his little boots that she had cleaned. The boy put them on, wondering, and she laced them. With eyes streaming, she took up one of the little cork boats, which he kept on the window-stool, floating in a wooden bowl. "You'll give me one of them, darlin', to old Mammy for a keepsake?" "Oh, yes, choose a good one, the one with the gold paper on the pin. That one sails the best of all." And she cried bitterly, before she could go on, "And this is the little box I'll put them in." And she picked them out of the bowl, and laid them in a cardboard box, which she quickly tied round. "And this is the last day of poor Mammy with her bright only darlin', for your friends are sending for you today, and Mr. Archdale will be here in 10 minutes, and you're to go with him. Oh, my precious, the light o' the house, and to leave me alone." The boy stood up, and with a cry ran and threw his arms round her, where she stood near the clock. "Oh, no, no, no! Oh, Mammy, you wouldn't! You couldn't! You couldn't!" "Oh, darlin', you're breaking my heart. What can I do?" "Don't let me go! Oh, Mammy, don't! Oh, you couldn't! You couldn't!" "But what can I do, darlin'? Oh, darlin', what can I do?" "I'll run away, Mammy, I'll run away, and I'll come back when they're gone and stay with you. Oh, God Almighty," she cried, "here he's comin'. I see him comin' down the Hazel Road. Hide me, Mammy, hide me in the press. Oh, Mammy, Mammy, You wouldn't give me to him?" The boy had got into this large old painted press and coiled himself up between two shelves. There was hardly a moment to think, and yielding to the instinct of her desperate affection and to the child's wild appeal, she locked the door and put the key in her pocket. She sat down. She was half stunned by her own audacity. She scarcely knew what she had done. Before she could recover herself, the door darkened. A hand crossed the hatch and opened it, and ex-Sergeant Major Archdale entered the cottage. In curt military fashion he announced himself and demanded the boy. She was looking straight in this formidable man's face, and yet it seemed as if he were vanishing from before her eyes. "Where's the boy?" inquired the chill, stern voice of the sergeant. It seemed to her like lifting a mountain, this effort to speak. She felt as if she were freezing as she uttered the denial, "He ain't here." "Where is he?" demanded the sergeant's imperturbably clear-cold voice. "He's run away," she said with an effort, and the sergeant seemed to vanish quite away, and she thought she was on the point of fainting. The sergeant glanced at the breakfast table and saw that the two had taken tea together. He saw the carpet-bag packed. Intimated Archdale with closed lips. He looked round the cottage room, and the sergeant sat down wonderfully composed, considering the disconcerting nature of the announcement. The ex-sergeant major had in his time commanded parties in search of deserters, and he was not a bad slot-hound of that sort. "He breakfasted with you?" said he, with a cool nod toward the table. There was a momentary hesitation, and she cleared her voice and said, "Yes." Archdale rose and placed his fingers on the teapot. "That's hot," said the sergeant, with the same inflexible dignity. Marjory was awfully uneasy. "He can't be far. Which way did he go?" "Out by the door. I can't tell." The ex-sergeant major might have believed her the goddess of truth itself, or might have thought her the most impudent liar in England. You could not have gathered in the least from his countenance toward which view his conclusions tended. The sergeant's light cold grey eye glided round the room, and there was another silence, awfully trying to our good friend Marjory. End of chapter 61. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 62 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. The March to Noulton Farm. "I think, ma'am, the boy's in the house. You best give him up, for I'll not go without him. How many rooms have you?" "3 in a loft, sir." The sergeant stood up. "I'll search the house first, ma'am, and if he's not here, I'll inform the police and have him in the hue and cry. And if you have had anything to do with the boy's deserting, or had a hand in making away with him anyhow, I'll have you in jail and punished. I must secure the door, and you can leave the house first if you like best." "Very well, sir," answered she. But at this moment came a knocking and crying from within the press. "Oh, no, 'twasn't Mammy. 'Twas I that did it. Don't take Mammy." "You see, ma'am, you give useless trouble. Please open that door. I shall have to force it otherwise." He added as, very pale and trembling, she hesitated. Standing as he might before his commanding officer, stiff with his heels together, With his inflexibly serene face full before her, he extended his hand and said simply, "The key, ma'am." In all human natures, the wildest and most stubborn, there is a point at which submission follows command, and there was that in the serenity of the ex-sergeant major which went direct to the instinct of obedience. It was quite idle any longer trying to conceal the boy. With a dreadful ache at her heart, she put her hand in her pocket and handed him the key. As the door opened, the little boy shrank to the very back of the recess, from whence he saw the stout form of the sergeant stooped low as his blue, smooth, fixed countenance peered narrowly into the dark. After a few seconds he seemed to discern the figure of the boy. "Come, you, sir, get out," said the commanding voice of the visitor, as the cane which he carried in his hand, paid round with wax end for some 3 inches at the extremity, began switching his little legs smartly. "Oh, sir, for the love of God!" cried Marjory, clinging to his hand. "Oh, sir, he's the gentlest little creature, and he'll do whatever he's bid, and the lovingest child in the world." The boy had got out by this time, and looking wonderingly in the man's face, was unconsciously, with the wincing of pain, lifting his leg slightly, for the sting of the cane was quite new to him. "If I catch you at that work again, I'll give you 5 dozen, said his new acquaintance. "Is this his?" said he, touching the carpet-bag with his cane. "Yes, sir, please." He took it in his hand and glanced at the boy. I think it was in his mind to make him carry it, but the child was slender, and the bag, conscientiously packed with everything that had ever belonged to him, was a trifle too heavy. "Anything else?" demanded the sergeant major. This, God bless him." It was the little box with his ships. "And this," she thrust the griddle cake, broken across and rolled up in brown paper, into the boy's pocket. "And these," and 3 apples she had ready, she thrust after him. "And whole, my blessed darling, my darling, darling, darling." He was lifted up against her heart, folded fast, and hugging her round the neck, they kissed and cried and cried and kissed, and at last she let him down, and the sergeant major, with a cane under his arm, the carpet-bag in one hand and the boy's wrist firmly held in the other, marched out of the door. "That's enough. Don't follow, woman," said he, after they had gone about 20 yards on the path. "And I'll report you," he added with a nod, which, with these pleasant words, she might take as a farewell or not, as she pleased. She stood on the little rising ground by the hawthorn tree, kissing her hands wildly after him, with streaming eyes. "I'll be sure to see you soon. I'll walk round the world barefoot to see my pretty man again," she kept crying after him. "And I'll bring the 9-pins, I'll be sure. Mammy's coming, my darling." And the receding figure of the little boy was turned toward her all it could. He was gazing over his shoulder, with cheeks streaming with tears, and his little hand waving yearningly back to her until he was out of sight. And after a while she turned back, and there was their 9-pins ground, and the tarn, and her sobs quickened almost to a scream, and she sat down on the stone bench under the window, for she could not bear to enter the dark cottage, and there, in Irish phrase, she cried her fill. In the meantime, Archdale and his companion, or prisoner, which you will, pursued their march. He still held the boy's wrist, and the boy cried and sobbed gently to himself all the way. When they came down to the little hamlet called Maple Wickets, he hired a boy to carry the carpet-bag to Wunning, 4 miles further on, where the Warhampton bus passes, as everybody knows, at 12:30 o'clock daily. They resumed their march. The sergeant was a serenely taciturn man. He no more thought of addressing the boy than he did of apostrophizing the cane or the carpet-bag. He let him sob on, and neither snubbed nor consoled him, but carried his head serene and high, looking straight before him. At length the novelty of the scene began to act upon the volatility of childhood. As he walked by the sergeant, he began to prattle, at first timidly, and then more volubly. The first instinct of the child is trust. It was a kind of consolation to the boy to talk a great deal of his home, and Tom Orange was of course mentioned with the usual inquiry, "Do you know Tom Orange?" "Why so?" Then followed the list of that facetious and brilliant person's accomplishments. "And are we to go near a place called Wyvern or Carwell Grange?" asked the boy, whose memory, where his fancy was interested, was retentive. "Why so?" again demanded the sergeant, looking straight ahead before him. "Because Tom Orange told me there's the biggest mushroom in the world grown up there, and that the owner of the house can't get in, for it fills up the door." "Tom Orange told you that?" demanded the sergeant in the same way. And the boy, supposing it incredulity on his part, assured him that Tom, who was truth itself, had told him so only yesterday. The sergeant said no more, and you could not have told in the least by his face that he had made a note of it and was going to report Tom Orange in the proper quarter. And in passing I may mention that about 3 weeks later Tom Orange was peremptorily dismissed from his desultory employments under Mr. Archdale, and was sued for stealing apples from Warhampton Orchard, and some minor peccadilloes, and brought before the magistrates, among whom sat, as it so happened on that occasion, Squire Fairfield of Wyvern, who was precious hard on him, and got him in for more than a month with hard labor. The urchin hireling with the carpet-bag trudged on in front as the sergeant major had commanded. Our little friend, with many a sobbing sigh, and a great load at his heart, yet was looking about him. They were crossing a moor, with beautiful purple heather, such as he had never seen before. The sergeant had let go his wrist. He felt more at his ease every way. There were little pools of water here and there which attracted the boy's attention and made him open his box of cork boats and peep at them. He wondered how they would sail in these dark little nooks. And at last, one lying very conveniently, he paused at its margin and took out a ship and floated it, and another, and another. How quickly seconds fly and minutes! He was roused by the distant voice of the sergeant major shouting, "Hullo, you sir, come here." He looked up. The sergeant was consulting his big silver watch as he stood upon a little eminence of peat. By the time he reached him, the sergeant had replaced it, and the 2 or 3 seals and watch key he sported were dangling at the end of his chain upon his paunch. The sergeant was standing with his heels together, and the point of his cane close to the side of his boot. "Come to the front," said the sergeant. "Give up that box," said he. The boy placed it in his hand. He uncovered it, turned over the little navy with his fingers, and then jerked the box and its contents over the heath at his side. "Don't pick one of 'em up," said he. "Move half a pace to the right," was the next order. His next command was, "Hold out your hand." The boy looked in his face surprised. The sergeant's face looked not a bit angrier or a bit kinder than usual, perfectly serene. "Hold out your hand, sir." He held it out, and the cane descended with a whistling cut across his fingers. Another. The boy's face flushed with pain, and his deadened hand sunk downward. An upward blow of the cane across his knuckles accompanied the command, "Hold it up, sir," and a third cut came down. The sergeant was strong and could use his wrist dexterously. "Hold out the other," and the same discipline was repeated. Mingled with and above the pain which called up the three great black wells across the slender fingers of each hand was the sense of outrage and cruelty. The tears sprang to his eyes, and for the first time in his life he cried passionately under that double anguish. "Walk in front," said the sergeant serenely. And squeezing and wringing his trembling hands together, the still writhing little fellow marched along the path, with a bitterer sense of desolation than ever. The bus was late at Wanning, and a lady in it, struck by the beauty and sadness of the little boy's face, said some kind words and seemed to take to him, he thought, with a tenderness that made his heart fuller. And it was a labor almost too great for him to keep down the rising sobs and the tears that were every moment at the point of flowing over. This good Samaritan brought a bag of what were called gingerbread nuts, quite a little store, which Archdale declined, leaving at the boy's discretion. But I am bound to say that they were served out to him from day to day with conscientious punctuality by the sergeant major, who was strictly to be depended on in all matters of property, and would not have nibbled at one of those nuts though his thin lips had watered and not a soul had been near. He must have possessed a good many valuable military virtues, or he could not, I presume, have been where he was. Noulton Farm is a melancholy but not an ugly place. There are a great many trees about it. They stand too near the windows. The house is small and old, and there is a small garden with a thick high hedge round it. The members of the family were few. Miss Mary Archdale was ill when they arrived. She was the only child of the ex-sergeant, who was a widower, and the new inmate of the house heard of her with a terror founded on his awe of her silent father. They entered a small parlor, and the boy sat down in the chair indicated by the sergeant. That person hung his hat on a peg in the hall, and placed his cane along the chimney-piece. Then he rang the bell. The elderly woman, who was the female staff of the kitchen, entered. She looked frightened, as all that household did in their master's presence, and watched him with an alarmed eye. "Where's Miss Mary?" "A spitting blood, sir, please." "Bring in supper," said the sergeant. The boy sat in fear at the very corner of the table. His grief would not let him eat, and he sipped a cup of tea that was too hot and had neither milk nor sugar enough. The sergeant snuffed his candle, and put on a pair of plated spectacles, and looked through his weekly paper. While he was so employed, there glided into the room a very slight girl with large eyes and a very pale face. Her hair was brown and rich. The hand with which she held her shawl across was very thin, and in her pale face and large eyes was a timid and imploring look that struck the little boy. She looked at him, and he at her silently. Her sad eyes lingered on his face for a moment, and he felt that he liked her. She took a chair very softly and sat down without saying a word. In a little while the sergeant laid down his paper and looked at her. Her large eyes were raised toward him with timid expectation, but she did not speak. "Not well just now?" "No, sir." "You take the bottle regularly?" "Yes, sir." "You'll be better in the morning, belike." "I'm sure I shall, sir." He lighted a candle that stood on a side table, and his dog Bayan got up to attend him. It was a large pug dog, gamboge-colored, with a black nose. The boy often afterwards wished to play with Bayan and make his acquaintance, but he did not know how the attempt would be taken either by the dog or his master, so he did not venture. No caresses passed between the dog and the sergeant. Each did his duty by the other, and they understood one another, I suppose, but no further signs of love appeared. The sergeant went out and shut the door, and the girl smiled very sweetly on the little guest, and put out her hand to welcome him. "I'm very glad you are come here. I was very lonely. My father is gone to the workroom. He's making an organ there, and he won't come back till 8:45. That's an hour and 3/4. Do you hear? Listen." She raised her finger and looked toward the partition as she spoke, and he heard a booming of an organ through the wall. "Tony blows the organ for him." Tony was a little boy from the workhouse who cleaned knives, forks, shoes, and made himself generally useful, being the second servant, the only male one in their modest establishment. "I wish I was better. I'm so out of breath talking. We'll be very happy now. That's tuning the pipes. That one's wolving. I used to blow the bellows for him, but the doctor says I must not, and indeed I couldn't now. You must eat something and drink more tea, and we'll be great friends, shan't we?" So they talked a great deal, she being obliged to stop often for breath, and he could see that she was very weak, and also that she stood in indescribable awe of her father. But she said he's a very good man, and he works very hard to earn his money. But he does not talk, and that makes people afraid of him. He won't be back here until he comes here to read the Bible and prayers at 8:45. So they talked on, but all the time in an undertone, and listening every now and then for the boom of the pipes, and the little boy opened his heart to her and wept bitterly, and she cried too silently as he went on, and they became very near friends. She looked as if she understood his griefs. Perhaps her own resembled his. The old woman came in and took away the tea things, and shortly after the sergeant entered and read the chapter and the prayers. End of chapter 62. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 63 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 63. A Silent Farewell. At Noulton Farm each day was like its brother. Inflexible hours, inflexible duties, all proceeded with a regimental punctuality. At meals not a word was spoken, and while the master of the house was in it, all conversation was carried on, even in remote rooms, in an undertone. Our little friend used to see the workhouse boy at prayers morning and evening, and occasionally to pass his pale, disquieted face on the stairs or lobbies when his duties brought him there. They eyed one another wistfully, but dared not speak. Mr. Archdale had so ordained it. That workhouse boy, perhaps he was inefficient. Perhaps too much was expected from him. But he had the misfortune perpetually to incur, I can hardly say his master's displeasure, for the word implies something emotional, whereas nothing could be at all times more tranquil and cold than that master, but his correction. These awful proceedings occurred almost daily, and were conducted with the absolute uniformity which characterized the system of Noulton Farm. At 11 o'clock the cold voice of the sergeant major called, "Tony!" and Tony appeared, writhing and whimpering by anticipation. "My cane," said the master, stepping into the room which he called the workshop, where the organ, half finished, stood, stop diapason, dulciana, and the rest in deal rows, with white chips, chisels, lead, saws, and glue pots, in industrious disorder around. Then Tony's pale, miserable face was seen in the parlor, and Miss Mary would look down on the floor in pale silence, and our little friend's heart would flutter over his lesson book as he saw the lank boy steal over to the chimney-piece and take down the cane, and lingeringly disappear. Then was heard the door of the workshop close, and then very faint, the cold clear voice of the master, then faint and slow the measured cut of the cane, and the whine of the boy rising to a long hideous yell, and, "Oh dear, sir! Oh, sir dear! Oh, Mr. Archdale! Oh, master dear! Oh, master dear!" And this sometimes so protracted that Mary used to get up and walk round the room in a kind of agony, whispering, "Oh, poor boy! Oh, poor Tony! Oh, mercy! Oh, goodness! Oh, my God! When will it be over?" And sitting apart, the little boy's eyes, as they followed her, would fill with tears of horror. The little fellow said lessons to Mr. Archdale. There was nothing unreasonable in their length, and his friend Mary helped him. It was well for him, however, that he was a bright little fellow, with a good memory, for the sergeant was not a teacher to discriminate between idleness and dullness. No one ever heard Mr. Archdale use a violent expression or utter a curse. He was a silent, cold, orderly person, and I think the most cruel man I ever saw in my life. He had a small active horse and a gig, in which he drove upon his outdoor business. He had fixed days and hours for everything, except where he meditated a surprise. One day the sergeant major entered the room where the boy was reading at his lessons, and, tapping him on the shoulder, put the county newspaper into his hand, and, pointing to a paragraph, desired him to read it, and left the room. It was a report of the proceedings against Tom Orange, and gave a rather disreputable character of that amusing person. There was a great pain at the boy's affectionate heart as he read the hard words dealt to his old friend, and worse still, the sentence. He was crying silently when the sergeant returned. That stern man took the paper, and said in his cold, terrible tones, "You've read that?" "Yes, sir." "And understand it?" "Yes, sir." If I find you speaking to Tom Orange, I'll tie you up in the workshop and give you 5 dozen. And with this promise, he serenely left him. Children are unsuspicious of death, and our little friend, who every night used to cry in his bed silently with a bursting heart, thinking of his mammy and old times, till he fell asleep in the dark, never dreamed that his poor friend Mary was dying. She perhaps herself did not think so any more than he, but everyone else said it. They two grew to be great friends. Each had a secret, and she trusted hers to the little friend whom God had sent her. It was the old story, the troubled course of true love. Willie Fairlace was the hero. The sergeant major had found it all out, and locked up his daughter, and treated her, it was darkly rumored, with cruel severity. He was proud of his daughter's beauty, and had ambitious plans, I dare say, and he got up Willie's farm. And Willie was ruined, and had enlisted, and was gone. The sergeant major knew the post-office people in the village, and the lovers dared not correspond directly. But Willie's cousin, Mrs. Page, heard from him regularly, and there were long messages to Mary. His letters were little else. And now, at last, had come a friend to bear her messages to trusty Mrs. Page, and to carry his back again to Noulton Farm. After her father had gone out, or in the evening when he was at the organ in the workshop, and sometimes as wrapped in her cloak on a genial evening, she sat on the rustic seat under the great ash-tree, and the solemn and plaintive tones of the distant organ floated in old church music from the open window, through the trees, and down the fragrant field toward the sunset sky, filling the air with grand and melancholy harmony. She would listen to that whispered message of the boys, looking far away and weeping and holding the little fellow's hand, and asking him to say it over again, and telling him she felt better, and thanking him, and smiling and crying bitterly. One evening the sergeant was at his organ pipes as usual. The boy, as he stood in the garden at his task, watering the parched beds, heard a familiar laugh at the hedge, and the well-known refrain, "Tag, tag, merry derry periwig, and hatband hic hoc horum genitivo." It was Tom Orange himself. In spite of his danger, the boy was delighted. He ran to the hedge, and he and Tom, in a moment more, were actually talking. It became soon a very serious conversation. The distant booming of the organ pipes assured him that the light gray eye and sharp ear of the sergeant were occupied still elsewhere. Tom Orange was broaching a dreadful conspiracy. It was no less than that the boy should meet him at the foot of the field where the 2 osiers grow, at 11 o'clock, on the night following, and run away with him, and see Mammy again, and come to a nice place where he should be as happy as the day is long, and Mammy live with him always, and Tom look in as often as his own more important business would permit. "I will, Tom," said the boy, wildly, and very pale. "And, oh, Tom, I was so sorry about the trial, and what lies they told," said the boy, after they had talked a little longer, "and saying that you had been with gypsies, and were a poacher, and, oh, Tom, is Mammy quite well?" "Yes, and all my ships were lost on the moor. And how is little Toosie, the cat?" "Very well, blooming, blushing. And, Tom, you are quite well?" "Never better, as I lately told Squire Harry Fairfield, and mind ye, I'll be even yet with the old boy in here," and he indicated the house with a jerk of his thumb. "I don't hear the organ, Tom. Good-bye." And Tom was off in a moment, and the boy had resumed his watering pot, and that evening he sat down with, for the first time, a tremendous secret at his heart. There was one grief, even in the hope of his liberation, when he looked at poor Mary and thought how lonely she would be. Oh, if poor Mary could come with him! But some time or other he and Tom would come and take her away, and she would live with him and Mammy, and be one of that happy family. She did not know what thoughts were in the boy's mind as his sad, earnest eyes were fixed on her, and she smiled with a little languid nod. But he need not have grieved his gentle heart on this account. There was not to be a seeming desertion of his friend, nor anything she could mistake for a treacherous slight. That morning, at 2:00, Mary died. About 10 minutes before, an alarm from the old servant who slept in the room called up her father. Her faithful little friend was on his knees, sobbing beside the bed, with her wasted hand in his, as the sergeant major, hastily dressed, walked in and stood by the curtain, looking down into those large, deep eyes. She was conscious, though she could not speak. She saw, as she looked up her last look, a few sullen drops gather in those proud eyes and roll down his cheeks. Perhaps the sad, wondering look with which she returned these signs of tenderness smote him, and haunted him afterwards. There was a little motion in her right hand, as if she would have liked him to take it, in sign of reconciliation, and with those faint tokens of the love that might have been. The change of death came, and the troubled little heart was still, and the image of Willie Fairlace was lost in the great darkness. Then the little boy cried aloud wildly, "Oh, Mary, pretty Mary! Oh, Mary, are you dead? Oh, isn't it a pity? Isn't it a pity? Oh, is she dead?" The sergeant dried his eyes hastily. He hoped, I dare say, that no one had seen his momentary weakness. He drew a long breath. With a stern face he closed the pretty eyes that Willie Fairlace, far away now, will never forget, and closed the little mouth that never will complain, or sigh, or confess its sad tale more. "You had better get to your room, boy. Get to your bed," said the sergeant, not ungently laying his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You'll take cold. Give him a candle." End of chapter 63. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 64 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 64. The March by Night. The next day the sergeant was away in his gig to Wyvern, a long journey, to report to the squire and obtain leave of absence from his duties for a day or two. He was to spend that night at Hatherton, there to make arrangements about the funeral. It was a relief to all at Noulton Farm, I need hardly say, when the master of the house was away. A very sad day it was for the boy, a day whose gloom was every now and then crossed by the thrill and fear of a great excitement. As evening darkened, he went out again to the garden in the hope of seeing Tom Orange. He would have liked that cheer at the eve of his great venture. But Tom was not there. Neither counsel nor encouragement to be heard. Nothing but the song of the small birds among the leaves, and the late flowers, soon to close, peeping from among the garden plants, and the long quiet shadows of the poplars, that stood so tall and still against the western sky. The boy came in and had his lonely cup of tea in the parlor, and a little talk with the somewhat sour and sad old servant. He was longing for the night, yearning to see Tom's friendly face, and to end his suspense. At last the twilight was gone. The night had indeed come, and the moon shone serenely over the old grey roof and the solemn trees, over the dead and the living. The boy lay down in his bed at the accustomed early hour. The old woman had taken away his candle and shut the door. He lay with his eyes wide open, listening with a palpitating heart for every sound. The inflexible regularity which the absent master had established in his household was in the boy's favour. He heard the servant shut and bar the outer door at the wonted hour. He saw the boy's candle in his window for a while, and then put out. Tony was in his bed, and for tired Tony to lie down was generally to be asleep. Peeping stealthily from his lattice, he saw the old servant's candle glimmering redly through the window on the juniper that stood near the wall in the shadow, and soon that light also disappeared, and he knew that the old woman had gone into her room. It was 10:30. She would be asleep in a quarter of an hour, and in another 15 minutes his critical adventure would have commenced. Stealthily, breathlessly, he dressed. His window looked toward the osier trees where Tom was to await him. It opened lattice fashion with a hinge. Happily the night was still, and the process of preparing to descend perfectly noiseless. The piece of old rope that lay in the corner he had early fixed on as his instrument of escape. He made it fast to the bedpost, and began to let himself down the wall. The rope was too short, and he dangled in air from the end of it for a second or two, and then dropped to the ground. The distance of the fall, though not much, was enough to throw him from his feet, and the dog in the lock-up yard at the other side of the house began to bark angrily. For a minute the boy gave himself up. He lay, however, perfectly still, and the barking subsided. There was no other alarm, and he stole very softly away under cover of the trees, and then faster down the slope toward the appointed osiers. There indeed was Tom Orange, in that faint light, more solemn than he ever remembered to have seen him before. Tom was thinking that the stealing away this boy might possibly turn out the most serious enterprise he had yet engaged in. He had no notion, however, of receding, and merely telling the boy to follow him, he got into a swinging trot that tried the little fellow's endurance rather severely. I think they ran full 3 miles before Tom came to a halt. Then, more like himself, he inquired how he was, and whether he thought he could go on 15 miles more that night. Oh, yes, he could do anything that night quite well. Well, walk a bit, that you may get breath, and then we'll run again, said Tom. And so they set forward once more. They had now accomplished about 4 miles more. The little fellow was not so fresh as at starting. A drizzling rain, too, had commenced, with a cold change of wind, and altogether the mere adventure of running away was not quite so pleasant, nor even Tom's society quite so agreeable on the occasion as he had fancied. You have done 4 out of the 15. You have only 11 of the 15 before you now. You have got over 7 altogether up to this. Not so bad. You're not tired, youngster? Not the least. That's right. You're a good soldier. Now come. We'll stand close under this hedge and eat a bit. They supped very heartily on great slices of bread and corned beef, which bore ample traces of the greens in which it had been served when hot. "And now, boy, you must go on to Hatherton by yourself, for I'm known about here, and there's a fair there in the morning, and there will be people on the way before light. You must go a mile beyond the town to the George Public. Mrs. Gumford keeps it, and there I'll meet you." Then he detailed the route and the landmarks for the boy's guidance. "Take a drink of this," said he, pulling a soda-water bottle full of milk out of his coat pocket. "And when he had done, take a mouthful of this, my hero. It'll keep you warm." And he placed a flask of brandy to the boy's lips and made him swallow a little. "And here's a bit more bread if you should be hungry. Good night, and remember." After about an hour's solitary walking, the boy began to grow alarmed. Tom's landmarks failed him, and he began to fear that he had lost his way. In half an hour more he was sure that he was quite out of his reckoning, and as his spirits sank he began to feel the cold wind and drenching rain more and more. And now he found himself entering a town not at all answering Tom's description of Hatherton. The little town was silent, its doors and windows shut, and all except a few old-fashioned oil lamps dark. After walking listlessly about, afraid to knock and ask somewhere for shelter, worn out, he sat down on a doorstep. He leaned back and soon fell fast asleep. A shake by the shoulder roused him. A policeman was stooping over him. "I say, get up out of that," said the imperious voice of the policeman. The boy was not half awake. He stared at him. His big face and leather-bound chimney-pot looked like a dream. "I say," he continued, shaking him, but not violently, "you must get up out of that. You're not to be making yourself comfortable there all night. Come, be lively." Comfortable? Lively? All comparative, all a question of degrees. The boy got up as quickly as the cold and stiffness of his joints would let him. Very dutifully he got up and stood, drenched, pale, and shivering in the moonlight. The policeman looked down, not unkindly now, at the little wayfarer. There was something piteous, I dare say. He looked a grave, thoughtful man of more than 50, and he put his hand on the child's shoulder. "You see, boy, that was no place to sleep in." "No, sir, I'll never do it again, sir, please." "You're cold. You'd get pains in your bones." "I'll not any more, sir, please." "Come with me, my boy, it's only a step." He brought the boy into his house down the lane close by. "There's a fire. You warm yourself. There's my little one in fever, so you can't stop long. Sit down, child, and warm yourself." He gave him a drink of hot milk and a piece of bread. "You don't get up, you know. There's no need," he added. I think he was afraid of his pewter spoons. He kept the little fellow nearly half an hour, and he lent him an old bottomless sack to wrap about his shoulders, and charged him to bring it back in the morning. I think the man thought he might be a thief. He was a kind man. There was a balancing of great pity and suspicion. The boy returned the sack with many thanks in the first faint twilight of morning, and set forth again for Hatherton. It was, the fellow who directed him said, still 5 miles on. At about a mile from Hatherton, cold and wet, and fearing to be too early at the George Inn, the rendezvous agreed on, the tired little fellow crept in, cold and wet, to a roadside pot-house. At the fire of the ale-house 3 fellows were drinking beer. Says one who had now and then had his eye on the boy, "That boy there has run away from school." I cannot describe the terror with which the little fellow heard these words. The other two looked at him. One was a fat fellow in breeches and top boots, and a red cloth waistcoat, and a ruddy, good-humoured face. And after a look they returned to their talk. And in a little while the lean man, who seemed to find it hard to take his eyes off him, said, "That's a runaway, that chap. We ought to tell the police and send him back to school." "Well, that's no business of ours." "Can't you let him be?" said the red waistcoat. "Come here," said the lean man, beckoning him over with his hard eye on him. He rose and slowly approached under that dreadful command. I can't say that there was anything malevolent in that man's face. Somewhat sharp and stern, with a lean inflexibility of duty. To the boy at this moment no face could have been imagined more terrific. His only hope was in his fat companion. He turned, I am sure, an imploring look upon him. "Come, Irons, let the boy alone, unless you mean to quarrel with me. Damn me, ye shall let him alone. And get him his breakfast or something hot, and be lively," he called to the people, "and score it up to me." So, thanks to the Good Samaritan in top boots and red waistcoat, the dejected little man pursued his way comforted. As he walked through Hatherton, he was looking into a shop window listlessly, when he distinctly saw, reflected in the plate glass, that which appalled him so that he thought he should have fainted. It was the marble, blue-chinned face of the sergeant major looking over his shoulder, with his icy grey eyes, into the same window. He was utterly powerless to move. His great eyes were fixed on that dreadful shadow. He was actually touching his shoulder as he leaned over. Happily, the sergeant did not examine the reflection, which he would have been sure to recognize. The bird, fascinated by the cold eye of a snake, and expecting momentarily, with palpitating heart, the spring of the reptile, may feel, when withdrawing the spell, it glides harmlessly away, as the boy did when he saw that dreaded man turn away and walk with measured tread up the street. For a moment his terror was renewed. For beyond, that yellow namesake of the philosopher, recognizing him, stood against the boy's leg and scratched repeatedly, and gave him a shove with his nose, and whimpered. The boy turned quickly, and walking away the dog left him, and ran after his master, and took his place at his side. End of chapter 64. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 65 of the Wyvern Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Chapter 65. Conclusion. At the George Inn, a little way out of Hatherton, the boy, to his inexpressible delight, at last found Tom Orange. He told Tom at once of his adventure at the shop window, and the occurrence darkened Tom's countenance. He peeped out and took a long look toward Hatherton. "Put the horse to the fly and bring it round at once," said Tom, who put his hand in his pocket and drew forth a rather showy handful of silver. I don't pretend to say, when Tom was out of regular employment, from what pursuits exactly he drew his revenue. They had rather improved than otherwise, but I dare say there were anxious compensations. The boy had eaten his breakfast before he reached Hatherton. So much the better, for the apparition of the sergeant major would have left him totally without appetite. As it was, he was in an agony to be gone, every moment expecting to see him approach the little inn to arrest him and Tom. Tom Orange was uneasy, I am sure, and very fidgety till the fly came round. "You know Squire Fairfield from Wyvern?" said the hostess, while they were waiting. "Aye," said Tom. "Did you hear the news?" "What is it?" "Shot the night before last in a row with poachers. Gentlemen should leave that sort of work to their keepers, but they was always a fightin' wild lot, them Fairfields, and he's lyin' now a dead man all the same, gave over by Dr. Willett and another, wi' a whole charge of duck-shot lodged under his shoulder." "And that's the news?" said Tom, raising his eyes and looking through the door. He had been looking down on the ground as Mrs. Gumford of the George told her story. "They're sharp fellows, poachers round there, I'm told," he said. "Next time he'd have been out himself with the keepers to take 'em dead or alive." "I suppose they wouldn't answer them." "'Tis a wicked world," said the lady. "Damned wicked," said Tom. "Here's the fly." In they got and drove off. Tom was gloomy and very silent. "Tom, where are we going to?" asked the boy at last. "All right," said Tom. "All right, my young master. You'll find it's to no one but good friends. And say now, haven't I been a good friend to you, Master Harry, all your days, sir? Many a mile that you know nothing about has Tom Orange walked on your business, and down to the cottage and back again. And where would you or her have been if it wasn't for poor Tom Orange?" "Yes, indeed, Tom, and I love you, Tom. And now I've took you away from that fellow, and I'm told I'm likely to be hanged for it. Well, no matter." "Oh, Tom, poor Tom. Oh, no, no, no." And he threw his arms around Tom's neck in a paroxysm of agonized affection, and in spite of the jolting, kissed Tom, sometimes on the cheek, on the eyebrow, on the chin, and in a great jolt violently on the rim of his hat, and it rolled over his shoulder under their feet. "Well, that is gratifying," said Tom, drying his eyes. "There is some reward for principle, after all. And if you come to be a great man some of these days, you'll not forget poor Tom Orange, that would have spent his last bob and spilt his heart's blood, without fee or reward, in your service." Another explosion of friendship from the boy assured Tom of his eternal gratitude. "Do you know this place, sir?" asked Tom, with a return of his old manner, as, making a sudden turn, the little carriage drove through an open gate and up to an old-fashioned house. A carriage was waiting at the door. There could be no mistake. How delightful! And who was that? Mammy! At the hall door. And in an instant they were locked in one another's arms. And oh, the darling, and Mammy, 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 were the only words audible, half stifled in sobs and kisses. In a minute more they came into the hall, smiling, weeping, and with hands extended toward him, the pretty lady dressed in black. And her weeping grew into a wild cry, as coming quickly she caught him in her heart. "My darling, my child, my blessed boy, you're the image. Oh, darling, I loved you the moment I saw you, and now I know it all." The boy was worn out. His march, including his divergence from his intended route, had not been much less than 30 miles, and all in chill and wet. They got him to his bed and made him thoroughly comfortable, and with Mammy at his bedside, and her hand, to make quite sure of her, fast in his, he fell into a deep sleep. Alice had already heard enough to convince her of the boy's identity, but an urgent message from Harry, who was dying, determined her to go at once to Wyvern to see him, as he desired. So, leaving the boy in charge of Mammy, she was soon on her way to the old seat of the Fairfields. If Harry had not known that he was dying, no power could ever have made him confess the story he had to tell. There were 2 points on which he greatly insisted. The first was that, believing that his brother was really married to Bertha Vildercost, he was justified in holding that his nephew had no legal right to succeed. The second was that he had resolved, although he might have wavered lately a little, never to marry, and to educate the boy better than ever he was educated himself, and finally to make him heir to Wyvern, pretending him to be an illegitimate son of his own. Whether the sergeant major knew more than he was ordered or undertook to know, he never gave the smallest ground to conjecture. He stated exactly what had passed between him and Harry Fairfield. By him he was told that the child which was conveyed to Marjory Trevellian's care was his own unacknowledged son. On the very same evening, and when old Mildred Tarnley was in the house at Twyford, was a child taken, with the seeds of consumption already active in it, from a workhouse in another part of England, and placed there as the son of Charles Fairfield and Alice. It was when, contrary to all assurances, this child appeared for a few days to rally, and the situation consequent on its growing up the reputed heir to Wyvern alarmed Harry, that he went over, in his panic, to the Grange, and there opened his case, that the child at Twyford was a changeling, and not his brother's son. When, however, the child began to sink, and its approaching death could no longer be doubtful, he became, as we have seen, once more quite clear that the baby was the same which he had taken away from Carwell Grange. Dr. Willett, seeing the child so often at Twyford, also prevented suspicion, though illogically enough, for had they reflected they might easily have remembered that the doctor had hardly seen the child twice after its birth while at the Grange, and that, like everyone else, he took its identity for granted when he saw it at Twyford. Alice returned greatly agitated late that evening. No difficulty any longer remained, and the boy, with ample proof to sustain his claim, was accepted as the undoubted heir to Wyvern and the representative of the ancient family of Fairfield. The boy Henry Fairfield was as happy as mortal can be henceforward. His little playmate, the pretty little girl whom Alice had adopted, who called her Mamma, and yet was the daughter of a distant cousin only, has now grown up, and is as a girl even more beautiful than she was as a child. Henry will be of age in a few months, and they are then to be married. They now reside at Wyvern. The estate, which has long been at Nurse, is now clear and has funded money beside. Everything promises a happy and prosperous reign for the young Fairfield. Mildred Tarnley, very old, is made comfortable at Carwell Grange. Good old Dulcibella is still living, very happy and very kind, but grown a little huffy, being perhaps a little over-petted. In all other respects, the effect of years being allowed for, she is just what she always was. Tom Orange, with a very handsome sum presented by those whom he had served, preferred Australia to the old country. Harry Fairfield had asserted, in his vehement way, while lying in his last hours at Wyvern, that the fellow with the handkerchief over his face who shot him was, he could all but swear, his old friend, Tom Orange. Tom swore that, had he lived, he would have prosecuted him for slander. As it is, the eccentric genius has prospered as the proprietor of a monster tavern at Melbourne, where there is comic and sentimental singing, and some dramatic buffooneries, and excellent deviled kidneys and brandy. Marjory Trevellian lives with the family at Wyvern, and I think if kind old Lady Windale were still living, the consolations of Alice would be nearly full. End of chapter 65. Recording by John Brandon. End of the Wyvern Mystery by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu.